Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Tonight, we've got a great guest, a longtime friend. He's been on this channel a long time, Mr. Rainer Shea. He writes great articles for his website, newswiththeory.com. So we're going to have a conversation taking it from many different angles about religion in American politics. Many different angles we're going to come at it with. So, welcome.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Alrighty. So, welcome, Rainer. How you doing today?
Oh, I'm coming along with all my life projects and with my political projects. What compelled me to set up a new stream with you today is I have seen the Center for Political Innovation work towards two goals, especially lately: stopping Kamala Harris in the 2024 election, and promoting a version of socialism that is compatible with Christianity. But there is a big narrative threat towards both of these goals right now: Project 2025, and most importantly, the ways in which the liberal media is reacting to Project 2025. Now, not everyone knows what Project 2025 is because it's something that liberals especially focus on. Project 2025 is the goal that the Right-Wing Heritage Foundation has put forth, the program that it's put forth that the Trump campaign wants to implement. It's supposed to be a radical overhaul of the existing forms of government. It's supposed to give the executive branch unprecedented power, at least within our lifetime, it seems, so that future President Trump can implement an extremely an extreme version of social conservatism, and that's what so much of the liberal media is reacting to right now. That's what I've seen. David Pakman, the Humanist Report, all of these liberal commentators, along with BreadTube, they've been responding to this in large part by using it to fearmonger. And well, here's the thing. Lots of people do have good reason to fear an agenda like this, but these commentators that I'm talking about, they're using it to promote the vote blue no matter who agenda. Alternatively, they're using it to promote just liberal tailism in general, where supposedly as communists, the only way that we can beat the right is by creating a different version of the Democratic Party's program, just with Marxist jargon mixed in.
Right. So I guess, the issue of religion and politics is a big one. And you gave us a great place to start with, what's it called? Agenda 2025, or what's it called? Project 2025, right? That's the new talking point. But I guess to begin with, do you want to share your religious background and my religious background to kind of give our viewers a way to start? What is your religious background, Rainer?
I don't have a religious background. I was raised secular, and I've throughout my life I have had to reckon with this because I live in such a religious type of society, in the United States.
And California too, right? California is a lot of religion out there, like, of different kinds too, right? Or no?
Well, yeah. Well, aside from the secular enclaves on the coast, yeah, California does have a lot of conservatism aside from those places.
Yeah. Is Humboldt County where you're at? Is there a lot of evangelicals there? Is there a lot of that or?
Yeah, aside from the college town that's nearby, yeah, there is plenty of religion here.
Okay. And I also understand that Northern California, there's a mountain called Mount Shasta that is really important to a lot of New Age religious people. Do you know about anything about that?
Oh, I haven't heard about that aspect of Mount Shasta.
Okay. Yeah, I know that there's a lot of like New Age religious groups, people who are into psychics and, ascended master teaching and some of that stuff. They really like Mount Shasta in Northern California, and that California is famous. There's a lot of tent revival stuff out there, which it's a very liberal state. So you would think that it wouldn't be the case, but I was kind of surprised. I was out in LA, I've been to San Francisco, and at the same time as you have a state that is very liberal, a lot of LGBT stuff, there is also a huge amount of Pentecostals, a huge amount of, it's a very religious state. And that's part of the California culture, right? There's kind of and it weirdly kind of mixes with hippieism in a way that it doesn't elsewhere. Is that correct or no?
Yes, I've definitely seen that. I've seen people who, well, maybe this is just an anecdotal story, but there is one dude I once met at the Arcata Plaza who's really into New Age stuff, and out of nowhere he suddenly said, "I want to become a Fed. I think I can change them from within." So apparently hippieism is compatible in a lot of cases with the deep state.
Wow, that's wild. That's wild. So yeah, my religious background, I grew up in the United Church of Christ, UCC, which was a mainline Protestant church, but the area that I grew up in was very, very evangelical. This was the time, I was a teenager when the USA invaded Iraq, and the Iraq War was going on, and my town was very conservative. It was like, my family, we knew about other religions. We talked to, my parents took me to different parts of the world. And, I traveled as a kid, and, we hosted a student from Pakistan who was a Muslim. So after 9/11, I remember people in my town were like, "Oh my God, Caleb's family knows a Muslim. They might be terrorists," and it was like, there was a lot of, people that were very religious, and it was kind of their way of being very, I don't know what the right word would be, being very, I don't know, very limited in their understanding of the world. You know what I mean? I remember having an argument with somebody in high school and just showing the statistics that Jews as a group tend to vote for Democrats, and he insisted that couldn't be the case because he'd read the Old Testament, and the Old Testament, no one who read the Old Testament could ever vote for a Democrat. It was like that kind of shallow, where they saw things through the guise of evangelical Christianity, where they had a really shallow understanding of what the world was actually like. They just kind of knew evangelical Christianity. So as a teenager, I became an atheist because I was so tired of that, right? And I didn't support the invasion of Iraq, and I didn't, I didn't hate Muslims, and and it wasn't really, until I was, I was in my late 20s when I was in Iran that I rediscovered my Christian faith. There's a whole story about that. We can talk about some other time on the ship to Yemen and stuff. So I'm a Christian now, but I'm not a Christian in the same way I was, right? When I was a kid, I was in a liberal Christian church surrounded by very, very evangelical people. And in reaction to that, I had to intellectually explore and challenge a lot of things. So, religion is something I think a lot about. My streams are getting more and more religious. And I know everyone in my audience isn't totally comfortable with that. And I do want to be clear, CPI is not a religious organization. There's plenty of atheists in CPI. I would say the majority of people in CPI do have religious belief, I would say at this point, but not everybody. And that's okay. And we're not, and we certainly don't, espouse any particular faith. There's Catholics in our organization, Jews, Muslims, people that are into New Age stuff. There was a member of our group who taught us all how to meditate at the last retreat. He's into Zen. That was really, really neat. And so, I am open to working with anybody in terms of religious faith, but religion is something I think a lot about. So I guess now back to the topic that you started with, this Project 2025. Now, is this related to the new anti-abortion law in Arizona?
Well, I'm sure that it's part of the same trend.
Okay.
The same cultural political trend where there's this increasingly coordinated push by the far right within American politics to push a socially conservative agenda, and it's a lot more cohesive than it was just 5 or 6 years ago in Trump's first term, and it's it's likely that Trump is going to have a second term, and when it happens, from what I understand, he's going to have a much more coordinated network of operatives to push his agenda forward.
Well, one thing that I will say that I just don't agree with liberals about, right, is, I actually attended, I reported on, I was in the auditorium at the Republican convention in 2016. I was there. I heard Donald Trump say it in the audience. When Donald Trump said, he said, something about LGBT rights, and the audience applauded, right? And then Donald Trump said, I'm so happy to see Republicans applauding for LGBT rights. And the audience applauded even more. And I remembered that moment because I thought, wow, I mean, the country has really changed a lot, because this is the Republican National Convention. And he said he supported LGBT rights, and the audience applauded. And then Donald Trump commented about how happy he was about that. But then when I looked at social media, I was told that, that if Donald Trump got elected, all these young LGBT people were going to kill themselves because Donald Trump's presidency spelled the end of LGBT rights in America, and there were going to be death camps for gay people or something. And I'm just like, I'm sorry, I was in the audience, right? And if I remember correctly, Caitlyn Jenner, formerly Bruce Jenner, the transgender athlete, is a big supporter of Donald Trump, a very famous transgender person. And Donald Trump made a big point during his campaign that Caitlyn Jenner could use any bathroom at any of his hotels. He was pro-trans in his hotel. And that I saw Donald Trump as the most pro-LGBT Republican that I've ever seen. Now, Mike Pence, his running mate, was not, right? I mean, and that's clear, right? Now, Mike Pence is from the religious right, but Mike Pence betrayed Donald Trump, right? Mike Pence, opposed Donald Trump, saying the election was stolen. And Mike Pence has supported the prosecution of Donald Trump at this point, right? Mike Pence is a neocon, and that there were neoconservatives that were in the Trump camp during his first term, but they've all turned against him. And they're the ones that are, have this record of I guess, what's his name? The Mike Pence, he had the anti-gay law. They're the law that like bakeries didn't have to make gay wedding cakes, right? And he had said that he supported people going to some kind of therapy that might cure them of being gay. And that's why people thought Mike Pence was anti-LGBT. But Mike Pence has turned against Donald Trump. I mean, he's at this point, opposed to him. The other thing that was interesting about that is I really do believe Pete Buttigieg, right? He's the gay mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Pete Buttigieg owes his entire career to Mike Pence, because Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana before he became Trump's vice president. And Pete Buttigieg is a famous gay Democrat in Indiana. And so it was almost like they elevated Pete Buttigieg, who's now the transportation secretary, as like revenge on Mike Pence. And I thought that was kind of amusing. I played a speech by a communist activist that she gave at a university, and someone in the audience was like scolding her for not voting for Biden, saying there's going to be a registry for all trans people and they're going to be rounded up and killed, and how dare she not vote for Biden. And it's like, I just don't see this happening. I mean, I know Trump supporters, as somebody who works at RT, who's been to Trump rallies, who interviews Trump supporters, they don't want to kill all the gay people. I mean, they don't. I mean, there's certainly a lot of questioning of the trans thing in relation to children, not wanting to put kids on puberty blockers, concerns about women's sports and that kind of thing. But the idea that all the gay people are going to be killed or imprisoned or something, where are they getting this? Is there any basis for any of this? I mean, is this just completely made up? Like, how do people believe this? I mean, it seems like they're in this alternate hysterical reality, right? It reminds me of when Al Gore was running against George W. Bush. All the Republicans I knew thought that Al Gore was going to confiscate all their firearms, right? And that was not going to happen. But it was just everybody knew that. No. If Al Gore becomes president, he's going to take all our guns away. And that's like, we've had 8 years of Obama. It's like they're not taking your guns away, right? But it was a similar kind of thing where it's like people attribute a position to a politician, and it doesn't actually match their position or what their supporters believe or anything. So, what do you make of this?
Well, that's an interesting transformation when it comes to Trump's role within the LGBT issue. Because I also saw it was striking how he said we support the LGBTQ community, even adding the Q, which most people don't usually use. And then because he has invested in support from the Christian right, he pushed a lot of their policies, and he picked Mike Pence as running mate.
Yeah.
And now he's tied in with the Heritage Foundation and its radical agenda, which, obviously its agenda doesn't reach the level of ISIS executing gay people, but this is a pretty detailed, extremely detailed plan for redefining the language that the U.S. government uses, so that LGBT people have more of basically an erased role, no role anymore within the government's consideration, and they plan to define any depictions of transgender people as pornographic. And so I can see why a lot of LGBT people would be alarmed by that. But the main thing that I want to do today is combat the narrative from the Democrats that the only way that you can respond to this is by voting for them. Because I've seen these.
Well, before we get into that, let's talk about the Heritage Foundation, right? Because that's a Republican think tank that's been around for a long time, right? And I believe they're neoconservatives, right? They are associated with the neocons. They are very pro-Israel. They were very much considered part of the Reagan Revolution. It's where a lot of academics and others that are part of the Republican Party, as it was like from Ronald Reagan on, they come out of the Heritage Foundation. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Long history there.
So I guess, can you get into the specifics before you talk about fighting against it or opposing it? What is in the plan, the agenda, the plan 2025? What is in it?
Well, there's a plan to increase it includes an expansion of the anti-abortion laws, like I said, the definition of transgenderism as being inherently pornographic. So that could actually lead to First Amendment issues. And there's it's anti-abortion laws, and it would define being transgender as pornographic. What does that mean? Define depictions of transgenderism as pornographic, as effectively codifying the censorship laws that we've been increasingly seeing within the U.S. schools throughout the last 5 years or so, where they've defined depictions of LGBT people as inappropriate for children, allegedly. And so they've been cracking down on that kind of content within these right-wing school districts. Project 2025 aims to expand and codify that. Okay.
All right. What else?
Well, like I said, the expansion of executive power to a level that's probably unprecedented in our lifetime. And a big part of that is firing a great deal of existing federal employees and either replacing them with people who are fitting the Trump agenda, the Project 2025 agenda, or not replacing them. They want to dismantle the administrative state, as Steve Bannon has put it.
Well, that's a weird thing, because executive power is something that we see both sides complain about, right? It's the ability of the president to do things without Congress's approval, right? The signing statements where they pass a law and the president signs it, but he puts a statement next to it like, I'm not going to enforce this, right? Or I'm going to instruct my administration not to do this. That's like one example of it, right? It's the idea of the president being able to do things without congressional approval, right? Moving toward a more centralized authority, which during the Obama presidency, Republicans complained about quite a lot. They were opposed to it, right? They said Obama was becoming a dictator. He was using the Department of Justice to target his critics or whatever. And that this seems to be a neocon thing. The neocons want a very authoritarian president. I think there's something they call the theory of the unitary executive, right?
Yeah.
They have some like legal theory where they reinterpret the Constitution to believe that the president has like more authority than most people would give the president, right? And that's a neocon thing. But conservatives brought it up and used it to attack Obama because they saw Obama as, overstepping his executive powers. But it seems like now, in the context of a conservative president, they would want to increase the powers. And it's one of those things that it's like, it's kind of like the filibuster. It's kind of like activist judges. Everyone loves activist judges as long as they're activists for your side, right? Right? Everybody loves unitary executive as long as it's, a president from your party who has all this authority. I mean, it's one of these things where both sides kind of, they trade back and forth, I remember like right after Obama got elected, all the Christian conservatives I knew suddenly became libertarians who were worried about our civil liberties being taken away. And I'm thinking like, where were you when Bush was torturing people? Where were you when Bush was tapping our phone calls? You know what I'm saying? Like, but suddenly now you're worried about the government coming after us. I mean, I share your concerns with the Patriot Act and all that, but where did you have them for the last 8 years? I mean, I see, and it's kind of like the children border thing. I mean, there were kids in cages under Obama. There were kids in cages under Trump. There are still kids in cages under Biden, and that none of that is okay. And just saying that it's not whataboutism, right? And that's, I understand that's not an argument. Saying, you do it too is not an argument. But, I mean, you have to acknowledge that, the idea that Trump is bad because he put kids in cages, I agree with, but so is Biden and so is Obama. And the media cared about it when Trump was in office, and they don't care now, and they didn't care before. I mean, I remember like a week after Donald Trump took office, they did a news story about a child killed by a drone strike. And I thought Obama has been killing children with drones for his entire presidency, right? And they never did a story about it. And all these liberals I knew were like, oh my God, look what America is becoming. It's like, it's been that for the past 8 years. That's one thing I never have had a tolerance for, Rainer. People whose outrage is on command. I really can't stand that. When people get, they get so morally outraged because CNN told them to, right? And all these people whose hearts were weeping for Ukraine, but it's like it never occurred to them that the USA bombed and destroyed Libya, the country with the highest life expectancy on the African continent, but they were just so morally outraged. It's like if CNN tells them about something, then they're allowed to care about it. I can't stand that, right? I mean, when people's supposed moral concern is on cue, they care when the government and the mainstream media tells them to care. I can't stand that. I really can't stand that.
Yes. Now I have something that I could add to that, but first I need to open the window more. It's
Sure.
Super hot in here with the heater. Anyhow, now that pertains to a figure that I would like to talk about, Jack Posobiec. He's somebody who is involved within this circle of far-right figures, and he made an infamous statement at this year's CPAC. While holding up a cross, he said something along the lines of, "We're soon going to replace democracy with something better. January 6th got us closer to that, but in time we will."
Do you have a clip? Is there a clip of that I could put on? Because I want to see what he said. Is there a YouTube clip of this?
Yeah, you could look up Daily Kos Jack Posobiec.
Right. So Jack Posobiec, I know he's kind of been the anti-Antifa guy, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, those guys.
That's kind of, he talks about Antifa and how they're not good or something like that. That's kind of been his thing. And I mean, he is an evangelical, I guess, right? I'm seeing, he calls for an end to democracy. Okay, it's a 17-second clip. I wonder if there's a video where there's more of it, because 17 seconds could be taken out of context, right? And I am at the point where I am suspicious of anything the liberal media says, but I see the 17-second clip. And I see it a bunch of places. Conservative activist calls for an end of democracy. I mean, I can pull on the 17 seconds, but I almost fear I'm taking it out of context. But 17 seconds, we'll see. All right, this is right-wing activist Jack Prosobiec calls for an end to democracy. Let's see what he said. All right. Let's see what he said. All right. We'll put the clip on. All right.
Welcome to the end of democracy. We're here to overthrow it completely. We didn't get all the way there on January 6th, but we will endeavor to get rid of it and replace it with this right here. We'll replace it with this right here.
Amen.
That sounds like a joke to me. That sounds like a joke about January 6th. That's what that looks like to me, because that's the talking point of the Biden administration is they're going to get reelected. They're going to get reelected, because you have to defend democracy. It is a little weird that he said we're going to replace it with this and held up a cross. That's a little bit weird, I will say. That's a little bit bizarre because, the Bible does not have a model for government anywhere in it, right? I mean, it doesn't. You know what I'm saying? Maybe in like the Old Testament, it talks about the kingdoms of ancient Israel or something, but that's a bizarre thing to say. And I see someone in the chat is saying that he's Roman Catholic, right? So I guess he's calling for like something like the governments that they have in Europe that are more like where you have a Catholic as the state religion. Is that what he's calling for? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, people seem to think that the Bible has a particular governmental program, and that's what I want to draw attention to, which is this faction that Jack Posobiec and also Steve Bannon represent.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very extreme iteration of American conservatism that is wholly obsessed with advancing the culture war. We see this with the kind of stuff Jack Posobiec says. Like he posts something glorifying Pinochet because Pinochet went against the communists because Pinochet murdered communists. And here's the thing about Jack Posobiec: he's a Fed. He's a naval intelligence officer, and the only reason why he left his naval intelligence job, he said, was because his political activities were causing disruptions in his workplace. And this is what I'm trying to get at. Even though the American religious right and the Democratic Party are obviously not the same, I believe that the faction of the religious right that Jack Posobiec represents is being used by the intelligence agencies to both steer American conservatives away from anti-imperialism and towards the culture war, and make the Democratic Party look better. That's my thesis.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Bannon is not good. My jaw dropped because I was watching Steve Bannon on C-SPAN, and he was talking about the Chinese Communist Party Congress, and he was talking about Xi Jinping's speech. And he said, if you listen to that speech, Xi Jinping, what he says is that there's been a war with America and that they won. And I had actually listened to Xi Jinping's speech to the Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. He didn't say anything about the United States anywhere in the speech, right? And I mean, so that was just a lie. It was just a lie. The other thing was, in his speech, it was about his concept of economic nationalism. And he was talking about how, like, we don't need jobs at Burger King. We need good paying industrial jobs. And he forgets that, those jobs in steel mills and auto plants weren't good until the communists came along and unionized them. Right. And he seems to think that Burger King just magically pays less, and unions and factory jobs just magically pay more. Well, it's labor unions that did that. The reason that industrial jobs paid so well, they didn't always do that. It wasn't until labor unions came along. So there's no knowledge of that. It's just like industrial jobs just magically pay better because, magic. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? And that, fast food workers could get paid decent wages in fast food if if the bosses were compelled to do it. McDonald's makes plenty of money. They could afford to pay a decent wage to their employees. They just can get away with not doing it because there's no union, because there's no, the jobs are easily replaceable and de-skilled with the technology. It's like an assembly line. It's basically like working in a factory. I've worked in fast food before years ago. It's basically like working in a factory, except it's, you're assembling a hamburger rather than, and yeah, they pay very low wages because they can get away with it. But if those workers were to have a union that occupied their factory, that forced the boss to sign a contract, that wouldn't be the case. But you wouldn't know that from listening to Steve Bannon's speech, right? And that Steve Bannon is obsessed with opposing China. China is the enemy. It's all about China. China is the enemy. And Jack Prosbayek, I get a similar vibe from him, right? It's the enemy are communists, which means China. One thing that does annoy me, and I've been speaking up more about this on social media. I try to stay off Twitter, but every so often I feel a need to get on there and say some stuff. I have seen so many conservative podcasts that start out by saying woke people are communists, right? And, and then they start talking about the Frankfurt School, and they start talking about woke people, how they're all communists. And that means they're just like Stalin and Mao. And then they trot out some anti-communist BS about Stalin and Mao. And that's why you should be a conservative. And I hear this and I'm just like, okay, like, have they ever seen a picture of North Korea? Like, North Korea is not woke. Like, I mean, I was just at the World Youth Festival with young people from North Korea, from Vietnam, from Venezuela, from all the communist countries. I didn't see any nose piercings or purple hair. No one told me to check my privilege. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like, that's just not, communism to the countries that actually have communist governments is about society controlling the means of production in order to raise people out of poverty, in order to move toward a higher stage of human development. It's not about, tearing things down and calling people fascist. And it's a completely different thing. And we know that like the Frankfurt School was funded by the CIA to oppose genuine Soviet communism. Modern art was funded by the CIA to oppose social realism, right? And so this idea that the woke people are all the same as North Korea, I don't understand how anyone can be that stupid. I mean, anyone who's been to actual communist countries know that they are not the same as the people that you find at anti-Trump rallies. They're not the same. But conservatives just say this and no one challenges them and no one opposes them. And then from there, they say things that are also easily debunked, like, oh, the Soviet Union never had any success. Everyone was just starving the whole time. And that's very easily debunked, right? They raised that country up. They industrialized. They invented space travel. I mean, the life expectancy tripled in the time that Stalin was leading the Soviet Union. I mean, it's like, so that's just malarkey, right? And I just see all this stuff. And the only rebuttal is woke people who show up. And of course, they have nothing good to say about China. They have nothing good to say about the Soviet Union. And they just call the conservatives racist. And so their argument never gets answered, right? And I mean, yeah, it's very frustrating to watch this kind of discourse, right? Where it's like we're having an argument about communism in which actual communists never get to talk, and that infuriates me to no end, right? We have an argument where two versions of anti-communism, right? Neoconservative and libertarian anti-communism and woke anti-communism get to have an argument. I mean, it would be like two of your friends arguing about you and you not being able to step in and give your version of the story. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like, it's infuriating. I mean, and there you go. And well, that's all I'll say about that now. What do you think?
Well, the truly insidious thing is the types of communists who advance wokeism while claiming to support North Korea and China. And that's part of Roy Singham's network. Roy Singham is a U.S. citizen, a millionaire living in Shanghai, who is funding a series of non-governmental organizations that advance this version of wokeism that claims to support existing socialism, and so that's a means of infiltration. That's Ben Norton, PSL. That's their main function, is to try and keep communism in America attached to wokeism, so that working class people who largely don't like wokeism, right, will be put off by it, right? And that anyone who then gets attracted to communism just becomes a drone for the Democratic Party, right? You just become
part of when CNN needs to a Black Lives Matter to cover, you get a hashtag and you go down and cover it, right? And they really want to make sure that no real working class movement emerges. So it's really maniacal. It really is, and I've seen very inaccurate things said by these folks. For example, North Korea is not into the transgender thing. They're not, right? Iran has transgender surgery. That is true. They do. You have to be one or the other, though. You can't, there's none of the intersex stuff, right? They do believe in transgender surgery in Iran, but North Korea is not into the transgender thing. But I've seen all over Twitter people claiming that North Korea is some kind of woke transgender paradise. That's not true. That's just not factually accurate. And why are people making these claims? Is that to help conservatives? Is that what that's about?
Well, I'm sure it has that effect to some extent, but I think the main thing is to blunt the communist movement. And the inverse to this is the type of psyop that I really want to talk about today, which is the type of religious rightism that is covertly supported by the intelligence agencies. And last year we got some more evidence when it comes to this, because it was revealed that the FBI had been infiltrating Catholic spaces,
yes,
under the rationale of stopping terrorism. And this wasn't just about stopping alleged terrorism. This was about influencing the Catholics in America towards an ideology that is compatible with Zionism, that is compatible with the culture war.
Well, that's very interesting, because I have become more and more aware of traditional Catholicism, or trad Catholics. I did not know these people existed. Probably the only knowledge I had of them was when I was a kid. For a while, my mom worked in Canton, Ohio, which is more of a bigger city. I mean, I grew up in a rural area. And it was mentioned that there was a church in Canton, Ohio, that still did Latin masses, right, in the Latin language, right? And I remember people mentioning that's very rare nowadays, right? Most Catholic churches do their mass in the language of the country that they're in. But it was mentioned that there was some kind of church in Canton, Ohio that still did Latin masses, and that was kind of a weird thing. And I now know that that's traditionalist or traditional Catholicism. And that there's a lot of people, there's many different wings of that, right? And then when I was in Iran, I met a guy, who, he was just in Iran. The Iranians really like him, named E. Michael Jones. And he lives in South Bend, Indiana, and he is anti-Semitic, and he is a traditionalist Catholic. He writes a lot of books on the history of religion and, such. And from a Catholic perspective, he makes kind of anti-Semitic arguments. But I understand traditionalist Catholicism is way bigger than that guy. It's a whole wing of people that are Roman Catholic, but they feel like the Vatican has lost its way by becoming too liberal, right? And that's who the FBI was infiltrating, if I understand correctly, right?
Yeah.
Is these networks of people. And these networks of people historically have been used by the FBI for anti-communist operations, if I understand correctly, right? They've been used to infiltrate communist organizations. They've been used to gather intelligence, and that anti-communism is a big part of their belief. And they think the Catholic Church has been taken over by communists or something like that, right?
Yes, yet at the same time, from what I've learned lately, these Catholics who oppose Pope Francis have at the same time become in support of Putin. And, of course, not in support of communism, but they're pro-Putin. It seems because Putin is viewed as a counter to American liberalism, a counter to liberalism in general.
Well, that's true. I mean, when I was in Russia, I did meet a number of people from Europe or the United States who moved to Russia because they don't want their kids to have LGBT stuff in school. And so there is a conservative appeal that Russia has. That is certainly exists. I can see that to some degree. I will say that I have heard trad Catholics, unfortunately in some of the places that I've been, I have heard them say very, very, very dumb things. At one point I had a trad Catholic guy who was going around saying, isn't it interesting that Russia hates Israel, but China is pro-Israel? And I mean, I said, Russia doesn't hate Israel. Like, Russia has diplomatic relations with Israel. There's Russian language TV networks that are aimed at Israel that are like funded by the Russian government. Like, Putin, until the recent events in Gaza, Putin and Netanyahu were friendly to some degree or other. I'm far more anti-Israel. Now, Russia has pivoted at this point because what Israel's doing is just unconscionable, right? But Russia has been much more pro-Israel, and so that was just false. But it fit his like trad Catholic view, which is communist bad, right? Communist bad and conservative Christian good or something. The other thing that's interesting is that Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism historically have not gotten along, right? A lot of Catholic Polish people really hate the Russian Orthodox Church and really feel that the Russian Orthodox Church is their enemy, right? And in fact, Brzezinski, he was a Polish Catholic, and that was like the main motivation for his anti-Russian insanity, his career as like a strategist. So that's a very, very weird thing. I do know there are trad Catholics of varying degree, right? What's also interesting is there are some trad Catholics who are against capitalism, right? Because the Catholic doctrine does condemn capitalism, right, as being sinful, and that the libertarian stuff that often accompanies right-wing anti-communism, there are a lot of trad Catholics who do believe in supporting labor unions, for example. They do believe in a welfare state, guaranteed health care and such, and that they're not free market in the same way that most American conservatives are, which is interesting.
Yep, that's another seed of revolutionary potential that these federal infiltrators want to squash. And they're doing that by promoting economic libertarianism in these spaces. They're doing that by getting these people to exclusively focus on the culture war, think that the primary contradiction is that abortion isn't repressed enough, stuff like that. It's all a diversion from the class struggle. And
you said it. And CPI, that has been our trademark, and that has been our best policy, I've noticed, is that we're not fighting a culture war either way. Right now, at the beginning, people accused us of being conservatives because they said, oh, look, you're not pro-trans enough. You talk with people that are But now you'll notice that the main attack we get is from people who used to be in our sphere, who now are attacking us for not being anti-LGBT, for not being anti-LGBT, for not being anti-abortion. We don't take a position. We want to talk about class struggle and economics. We want to talk about stopping the wars. And we're not interested in waging a culture war. And all the people that go astray, right? Whether it's the mainstream left that has completely gone astray and is just fighting a culture war against conservatives, or it's elements that are reacting to the mainstream left and they just go in the opposite direction. They never want to talk about the whole point of CPI. The whole reason we formed the organization was to not talk about abortion and gay marriage and LGBT and talk about getting justice for working families and stopping World War III. That's what we want to talk about, right? And it's weird to see a desperation on the part of the ruling class to get us talking not about that and about culture wars. And it's like the ruling class is desperate anyway. It's like, fine, okay, there was the first time when I was first out there doing communist stuff, there was this demand that I shout trans women are women and that I do this and that, and I wasn't going to do that, so I was canceled for that. And then now the attack that I get is, oh, you're not a social conservative. Well, I don't feel like a social conservative. I feel like as an American, the separation of church and state is one of the best things about our country. Because when the United States was founded with 13 colonies, 9 of the 13 colonies had a state religion. 9 of them. And the reason that the First Amendment, the first sentence of the First Amendment begins with, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The reason for that was because of the fact that there was an understanding that if there was a feeling that the federal government could create a state religion, that it would be imposed on the smaller states. And so to make sure that minority religions never had to be subjected to the government having another religion, it was understood that we would not have a state religion in the United States. And the reason that that's necessary is because we're so religious in America. In Britain, they have a state religion. They have the Church of England. And no one cares because Britain is a really, really secular society. So they have, the Church of England is the state religion, but no one cares. But in America, if we had a state religion, there would be violence in the streets. Can you imagine how Southern Baptists would react if Catholicism became the state religion? There would be violence in the street. Can you imagine how Pentecostals would react if we made Jehovah's Witness the state religion? You know what I'm saying? Like, it would never work here because people are way too religious. And it's ironic because, the religious right, the kind of neocon religious right that you're talking about always feels like separation of church and state is somehow oppressing them, right? It's like, oh, it's the government. No, it's the opposite. It's protecting them. Their ability to be religious fanatics, which America is a country of religious fanatics. There's no way around that. We are. It's in our blood. We have absorbed religious fanatics from every corner of the globe. This is a nation of religious fanatics. We would stop being that if we didn't have separation of church and state. We have to have a secular government so we can be the very religious country that we are, right? And that's what a lot of people don't get. We are way more tolerant of religious diversity in this country. For example, the area I grew up in Ohio, we lived near, they had their own schools, the Amish, right? No other country in the world would allow the Amish. No other first world country that I can think of, right? The Amish, they don't use running water. They don't use electricity. They live like it's the 1800s because that's their religion. They don't believe in modern technology. Now, if you went to France and you tried to do the Amish thing, they might let you do it, right? You and other adults. But the second you have kids and you're like, oh, I'm not giving kids running water because, that violates my religion. Oh, I'm not going to, get a heater for my home because that violates my religion. They'll take your kids away from you. Not in America. No, in fact, we accommodate them. We build special schools so that those kids can go to schools that have outhouses instead of bathrooms. I mean, it's crazy because we are so committed to religious freedom. Snake handling. You know about snake handling?
Snake handle. Oh, I think you talked about that. No, I don't. All I remember is you talked about that.
It's a religious ceremony. Tyler took he thought of this before I even said it. I'm taking the serpent right now. Where certain religious groups get venomous snakes that can kill you. And in front of the whole church, they put the snakes on their hand as they roll them up and down their bodies as they're praying. It's a way to test their faith. And a couple people die from this practice every year, right? There's a couple deaths almost every year from snake handling. But we allow it, in I think Tennessee and West Virginia, it is legal. Right. And there are children in the audience while these adults are holding snakes and praying to God, and a couple of them drop dead. I mean, this is crazy. They wouldn't allow that in any other country. We allow that. Right. We are very, very accommodating to religious diversity. The other thing is that there's been a large inflow of Muslim immigration, and that there are a lot of like Muslim communes throughout the United States. Right. Like in upstate New York. I know there's a lot of Muslims that have moved to the United States in the last few years, people who fled from Syria, people who fled from Egypt and places like that. And there are like little Muslim communes in upstate New York, little Muslim communes in Arizona, where they have their own little like Sharia Islamic Wahhabi community where the women are wearing the black, what do you call it? The burqa or whatever. And they're doing the prayer out of speakers. And it's like a Muslim country in the middle of the United States. And we allow that to go on because we are committed to religious diversity, right? So separation of church and state, in a weird way, my take on it is the opposite of the religious right. They're all like, oh, they're trying to outlaw believing in God. No, they're not. They're trying to enable you to do all the religious stuff that if we had a state religion, we would immediately crack down, right? If this was a Catholic country, we'd say Catholicism is the state religion. You might be able to practice your religion, but we're going to regulate these things. Now, the sky is the limit. And that's a really big part of American culture, which I think is interesting. Anyway, it's kind of a rant I like to go on, but continue.
Yeah, that shows why the position that the Fed-backed wing of the American religious right advances, that position it's not tenable, it's not practical under our conditions, because they don't seem to realize that if you were to make any particular religion the law of the land, like inherent to the government, that would destabilize our society.
It would.
So that their next best option is to advance a strange sort of pan-Christian agenda, like that tries to accommodate all these different strands of Christianity. But as soon as they take it too far, that's going to cause lots of problems.
Yeah.
And you know, the Democratic Party wants to exploit that. It wants to exploit that by scaring leftists into obeying them.
Yeah, I will say this. We should talk about who we're dealing with when we talk about the evangelical Christian right, right? Because we've always had religious fanatics in America since the time we were founded as a country. You know, in the night, you know, there was this famous Scopes monkey trial of 1927. You ever heard of that? It was a teacher was arrested for teaching evolution. Have you ever heard of that? I think it was 1924. Maybe. Yeah. You know, and you know, there's always been a level of religious conservatism in America, but in the early 70s, there was a pivot, right? What happened was, you know, Christianity was seen as conservative, right? It was seen as a conservative thing, and young people that had grown up watching television and listening to Elvis and the Beatles, and they were not into being religious. And the hippie counterculture thing was going on, and young people were not attending churches. But there was a very, very small, like, faction of the hippie movement that they called the Jesus freaks. They were like hippie Christians. And Reverend Billy Graham, who was actually Richard Nixon's spiritual advisor, Reverend Billy Graham, started featuring the Jesus freaks on his broadcasts. He would invite the hippie Christians to go on his religious broadcasts, and Billy Graham would give a sermon, and then they'd have some long-haired, you know, Christians come out and play a song or whatever. And then there was a guy, there was a Beatles marketer. He worked for a record marketing company I think in San Francisco. And he had a religious awakening. And he like had a vision. He walked out of a meeting one day and he had a vision, and his name was Tony Alamo. And he started a religious sect that was recruiting hippie Christian kind of people, right? And he set up a group that was very, very dedicated to kind of promoting this hippie Christianity stuff. And there was a lot of different stuff like this going on in the 70s. But around 1978, out of nowhere, you had Jerry Falwell. And Jerry Falwell became the spokesperson for this group called the Moral Majority. And part of the Reagan Revolution was like creating this layer of people that were it was like a reinvention of Protestant fanaticism, right? And that's where you have, you know, Christian rock music and the mega churches. You know about mega churches, right? That was a big thing when I was a kid. They had the mega churches, these churches that were huge. They'd have thousands of people there. You know, they'd have rock and roll, and then the minister would have a big like PowerPoint behind him with videos going while he's talking. And you know, a lot of these churches, if you ask them what they believe, their beliefs are really, really watered down. It's like, we just believe the Bible, man. God loves you. You know, they can't really explain their beliefs. It's just kind of, but you have to be a Republican, right? You have to be a conservative. You have to be against gay marriage. You have to be against abortion. You have to love the military. You have to love Israel. But other than that, they just believe the Bible, man. God loves you. We'll figure it out. You know, yeah, you know what I mean? It was mega church stuff that started. That was kind of that was a kind of a creation that surged forward the Reagan Revolution. And those folks have always been super pro-Israel. You must be loyal to Israel. Those pastors get flown to Israel and such. And those folks tend to be really, really militaristic and supporters of the military. And there was a lot of infiltration of U.S. military academies and military colleges by those folks, right? That was a big thing. And, you know, the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and then the first George Herbert Walker Bush, and then the second George W. Bush, you know, those folks really had a lot of power, but they lost it because of the internet. I remember the, you know, the new atheists, right? You know, the new atheist movement that started, you know, where all of a sudden Richard Dawkins was on every channel, you know, and that was, I believe what had happened was that the evangelicals had hurt U.S. foreign policy, right? I think that's what really happened, is that Bush had called the war on terror a crusade, had alienated a lot of Muslims who functioned as U.S. proxies, like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. And so in order to try and kind of expand American influence among American Muslims and to try and they had to weaken the religious right. And so Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, people like that got blasted out everywhere. And what's different now is because of these things, right? Because of these things, people are only evangelical Christians if they want to be. You know what I'm saying? When I was a kid, a lot of people were evangelical Christians because their parents were, because they grew up in a small town like mine. They were just along for the ride. But nowadays, there are a lot of evangelical Christians, but they've all made a choice. I'm not going to look too much into this thing, and I'm going to be an evangelical Christian. You know what I'm saying? They've decided, I'm going to just believe the Bible. I'm going to not believe in evolution. I'm not going to question anything. And, I'm not going to dig too deep. But if a teenager is starting to question things or whatever, they'll get their hands on one of these and they'll watch some videos and they'll stop being an evangelical, and I think that's very interesting. And, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, those people are, they very much are, a big force within the Republican Party, but they're not what they were. During the Bush years, these people had the power. I mean, they were very much running the foreign policy of the United States, and they're much weaker than they once were. I remember, there was something called Acquire the Fire. Do you remember? Or you're young, but it was like a rally for a religious government that was going around during the Bush years. They would have them in big auditoriums, right? And a lot of people at my school would go on buses to acquire the fire and hear these rallies about how we have to have a Christian revival, and we got to defeat the Democrats, and we got to fight Islam and stuff like that. And that there was definitely an attempt by the Bush administration. That was their mass movement, was the evangelical Christian right? It was the mega churches and the Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and all of that. It was that kind of, those people were the foot soldiers of the war on terror, of the Patriot Act, etc. And by about 2006, they had been played out. And the establishment was kind of scrambling, and the Republicans were kind of reinventing their message, right? I mean, and we see now the Republicans are very much, they're moving away from neoconservatism toward, I saw this, toward more hard right kind of stuff, which these trad Catholics, they're, the hard right. That's, they're, the anti-Semitism and the opposing capitalism in a right-wing conservative kind of way. That's not traditional. That's not neoconservatism. That's more like the old hard right. We're talking fascistic kind of, ideology, right? That's very different than what American conservatism has been for a long time. But then we also see, the mirror opposite of that, which is also very popular among conservatives now, which is libertarianism, right? We see John Birch Society kind of libertarianism. They want total free markets. They want no government imposing anything, right? So we see on the one hand this kind of right-wing Christian collectivism that's tied in with traditional Catholicism and such. And then on the other hand, we see this, this libertarian, get the government out of everything. We see that approach. The right has kind of, they're not what they once were. It's not the neocon right anymore. The right has kind of become, they've settled into being the opposition. I think that's really what it is. They, the right wing, they were the ruling force from the time of Ronald Reagan to the time of George W. Bush. Bill Clinton was a Democrat, but he was on the defensive. They were the ruling coalition, the neocons. And now that the right wing are the opposition, they talk very differently.
Yes, and the ruling class is a lot less comfortable with this new political paradigm than it was with the one from 20 years ago. They do not like the political realignment that has occurred throughout the last 10 years or so, where so many of the people on the right who just 10 years earlier would have been totally on board with neoconservatism, because they viewed American militarism as an ally of further ideals of God, country, and family.
Right.
Had a bit of a hiccup there, but they used to view God, country, and family as being supported by U.S. imperialism, but then they came to realize that U.S. imperialism is fundamentally liberal. U.S. imperialism, which is tied in with imperialism, is monopoly finance capital. Monopoly finance capital destroyed American living standards, After 2008, monopoly financed capital blew up the economy. The economy didn't recover. And a lot of conservatives reacted to that by coming to recognize monopoly capital as their enemy. And Trump was a manifestation of that, if only because he played into those resentments towards the highest levels of capital. And, he soon became an ally of monopoly financed capital because he's an opportunist. But the MAGA base, there is revolutionary potential among a lot of them. So the ruling class, when they, the highest level of the ruling class, when they go after Trump, they're really trying to suppress the political power of the people within Trump's base who could become anti-imperialists.
Well, what I will say, Rainer, is that, as I feel like an old man. I'm only 36, but I feel like an old man because I can remember how politics used to be before the financial crisis. The woke people now are just like the evangelical conservative neocons were during the Bush years, right? Because anyone who works in an office, anyone who's in a college atmosphere, who the super woke people are, right? And not to ever bring up certain topics around them. Not to ever make certain comments around them, because if you do, buckle in, because you're going to get a scolding speech of how dare, that's how the neocons were, right? I remember at my school and at my college, there were certain people that were huge Bush supporters, huge Fox News fans. Don't you dare say anything negative about the war in Iraq around them. Don't you dare, say anything critical of religion or anything while you're around them, or buckle in and you're going to have to listen to, no, you must not. You are a bad person for disagreeing with me. Yeah, and that's how woke people are. And it's the same way, right? It's the same way. And they had a very, you're with us or against us worldview. Like they were good people that were Bush supporters that supported our troops in Iraq and we're against gay marriage and we're against abortion. And then there were, these people who hate our country and hate our troops and, are against America. And, and that's how the woke people are now, right? You talk to them, there's good people who have Black Lives Matter bumper stickers and trans pride flags. And then there's people who deviate in some way and they are just not good human beings and they need to be scolded and browbeat into apologizing. It's the exact same thing. And I believe that wokeism probably uses the same kind of brainwashing that neoconservatism used, because it serves the same purpose: regime change, right?
Yeah.
And nowadays, regime change wars are sold on LGBT rights. They're oppressing the women. It's the same. And part of being a good liberal activist is not only saying Black Lives Matter in America, but it's also putting a Ukrainian flag in your window. It's also talking about Uyghurs in China, or whoever the latest group we're supposed to care about, according to CNN, is today. You have to be a globalist activist for American imperialism to be a good woke. That's kind of what the woke stuff is. And it's exactly the same as neoconservatism. It's just the value, the package is different, right? It's not about Jesus and it's not about the American flag. It's about social justice. It's about, but it's the same message, right? So there you go.
Well, what Project 2025 represents is the specter, whether realistic or not, of neoconservatism and cultural conservatism coming to dominate the United States again, and then coming back stronger than ever. And that's what these liberal commentators who talk about Project 2025 are implicitly saying is going to happen. But that's not too believable, because, see, you and Peter Coffin in a show from a few months ago made the observation that right now, even though wokeness is coming to have less of a prevalence within the American PSYOP machine, like with the escalation of the Gaza genocide, the anti-woke backlash that the deep state is supporting, it's a controlled anti-woke backlash.
Yes, sir. You are darn right about that. You said it. And I am getting more disgusted with anti-woke stuff than I have been. Every day it gets worse. It continues. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but yes.
Yeah. even if Trump becomes president, even if he is able to expand the executive power and implement all of these anti-LGBT and anti-abortion policies, then the deep state is still going to be in power, and the deep state is still really it's ultimately going to still be the main source of harm worldwide. U.S. imperialism is still going to be the primary contradiction, and these liberals constantly forget about that if they ever bother to think about it in the first place. All that they want to focus on is the culture war. And what Project 2025 is doing is escalating the culture war to such an extreme degree that it's getting these leftists and also the Marxists who are invested in leftism to get a type of Trump derangement syndrome or a derangement syndrome about conservatives in general. And it could get them to close themselves off from the majority of the masses by viewing the majority of the masses as synonymous with the most extreme elements of conservatism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Twitter is not a good site. I'm trying to stay off of it more and more. I mean, it's not a good website, but it's funny because I've been canceled many times. They've taken a tweet I've made and attacked me and circulated it. The biggest cancel I've ever gotten was I made a tweet where I said that, if you're against abortion or against gay marriage, I might disagree with you, but you're still my comrade. We need class struggle, not culture wars. That's what I said. I've said way more controversial things. I have tweets defending Stalin. I have tweets, about all kinds of stuff. But that was what Humanist Report was tweeting about it. And it got thousands of retweets. And you should have seen the messages I was getting. You want me to work with people who want to kill me. I said, where do you get that from? And many times I explained to people look, I have protested against the death penalty. In Ohio, I went to the Youngstown death row with priests and nuns who I'm pretty sure are against abortion and against gay marriage. And they're great people. And they got arrested protesting the death penalty. Should I have not have done that? I go to Palestine rallies to support the Palestinians. Now, what do you think the prevailing opinion among Muslim Americans about gay marriage and abortion is? And I'm saying all this tweet says is that I'll go to Palestine rallies, that I'll protest the death penalty with Catholic priests and nuns, that, I've marched. When I was in Cleveland, I was involved in police brutality work long before that was a trendy thing. And many Black ministers were out there talking about police brutality in the community and saying, they would be out there giving a sermon about police brutality. And then next they'd start talking about how homosexuality is really, really bad and internet porn is really, really bad. Social conservatism is out there among the people, right? And even in around causes that are traditionally left-wing, like police brutality, like Palestine, the death penalty, there are a lot of socially conservative people. And anyone who's done any real activism knows that. Malcolm X was in the Nation of Islam. Do you think they were pro-gay marriage? Do you think they were pro-abortion? It's like this cancel culture where it's like anyone who is against abortion and anyone who's against gay marriage is a bad person and they are toxic. You can't be a real activist and operate that way, right? If I got canceled for that tweet, every single person who ever went to a pro-Palestine rally should be canceled, because I can tell you the overwhelming majority of Muslim Americans are not pro-abortion and gay marriage. These people aren't even thinking about what they're saying, and they're tweeting at me, oh my God, you want me to work with people who want to kill you. Not every person who opposes gay marriage wants to kill you. You know what I'm saying? That's nuts. It's this derangement syndrome where it's not just Trump derangement syndrome. It's like conservatism derangement syndrome. There are many, many people in this world who are against gay marriage. Maybe there's a very small minority that might want to do you harm for being gay, but I think most of them just oppose gay marriage. There are many people in this world who are morally opposed to abortion. Many of them, I think, want it to be legal. They just don't believe in it, right? I believe when Bill Clinton ran for president, his slogan is, he said, legal and rare. That was his slogan, saying it was a bad thing for there to be abortion, but it should be legal. It would be harmful. That was the standard position. But now now it's like, if you don't immediately say that abortion is good, right? And if you don't say that anyone who's against gay marriage is a bad person I'll never associate with, you are a cancelable person. That was the biggest cancel I've ever gotten. There's never been a hate tweet against me bigger. And I thought, I stand by that tweet 1,000%. I said nothing wrong. I mean, and I think it's weird. I've said stupid things before on social media. I mean, we all have, right? But that was not one of them. And I thought, of all the things to like cancel me over, that was one of the weirdest cancels I've ever gotten. You know what I'm saying? That was just weird. It was out of nowhere. And I'm perplexed by it. But it says a lot about where social media is taking people, and a lot about what you're touching on, about how they're using this, what is it, Plan 2025. They're using that to create this kind of hysteria, right?
Yeah, we need an anti-imperialist united front, and that's the essence of why we are pushing this idea of unity on the basis of anti-imperialism, and also on the basis of a class struggle for those who have class consciousness. And like you said, there are a lot of Catholics who, even though they're socially conservative, even though they're so traditional, they're also anti-capitalist. Why can't we use that seed of revolutionary potential? Why can't we tap into these elements of people? I mean, the Muslims who you're talking about, who by and large are socially conservative, they're one of the biggest sources of grief for the Biden administration right now. They have the potential to make Biden lose this next election as punishment for his being complicit in the genocide. We cannot discard all these social elements.
Yeah, I mean, it's an odd time that we're living in. One thing that does give me hope, and this is something that I will say is very new, is I see people, are at my age and younger, exploring ideology in a way that they never would have. There were a lot of boomer communists I knew, and they became communists when it was a hip, cool thing to do during the 70s or whatever. And they did that their whole life. And, I grew up in a small town. A lot of the people I grew up around were conservatives, and they had been conservatives their whole life. Maybe they'd briefly been a liberal when they were younger, but they flipped or whatever. But what I see now is that there are younger people that will be, a trad Catholic one day, a communist the next day, an anarchist the next day. And in a way, that's a good thing, because it means people are thinking about politics in a much deeper way, right? It used to be politics was, which team are you on, the red team or the blue team? And now we've got younger people reading ideology and reading about these diverse ideologies. And that's really good, right? We're thinking about politics. The next generation thinks about politics with much more depth, right? And so that's good. However, my concern as someone who is, I've been doing communism my whole adult life, right? My concern is that for a lot of these younger people, it's almost just a form of passive intellectual entertainment. For a while, they read trad Catholic books. Then they read Buddhist books. Then they read communist books. Then they read anarchist books. Then they read fascist books. And it's just kind of, they're just kind of intellectually exploring, and it doesn't lead to any real activism, right? And that they're not really developing a lifestyle around any of these beliefs. They're just kind of intellectually exploring them, right? And this is when Peter Coffin, he talks about commodified identity, right? And how, he has that great documentary, Marx for Sale. Did you have a chance to watch Marx for Sale by Peter Coffin?
Oh, no, I think I saw that thumbnail. I should watch it.
Go watch it. It's a really good documentary that Peter Coffin did, where he talked about how there's just this whole marketing of Marxism as a social media brand, when communism has always been a practice. It's been a lifestyle. It's been people that are involved in the class struggle and communities of resistance, people coming together around their ideals, right? For a lot of these younger people, they have no notion of that, right? No notion of what, the closest thing I ever saw to what a real communist party was a group in Cleveland called Black on Black Crime Incorporated. It was I guess it was an NGO, but it was a Black nationalist activist group in Cleveland. It was led by Art McCoy, who owned a barber shop in East Cleveland. and he was a black nationalist, and he had a necklace of Africa, and since the 70s, he'd been a black nationalist, and every Wednesday night, he had 80, 90 people that would come out to this meeting, and they would talk about police brutality, they would talk about rising rent, they would talk about traffic lights in the neighborhood and safety on the streets. And they negotiated gang truces when gangs were fighting each other. They would go to the area where gangs were fighting and they would negotiate the gang truces. And they ran East Cleveland to some degree or other as community organizers, right? And, they were involved in police brutality cases. And I went to court with police brutality victims with them. That was what like the Communist Party was in the 1930s in New York City and in Chicago and San Francisco and places like that. They were that. They were a meeting every week where people would talk about the traffic lights and the rising rent and, and whatever issue was important. And that's what the Black Panthers were in the 70s, in the neighborhoods where they had a lot of influence before the FBI destroyed them, right? Is they were a group of people that came together, in their community to get stuff done. And the Uhuru movement is the closest thing to that exists in the United States right now, right? They are an anti-imperialist organization. And in two cities, St. Louis, Missouri, and in St. Petersburg, Florida, they have community centers, they do farmers market, and they're doing this kind of stuff. And that's why the American government is threatened by them. They're not threatened by somebody on social media tweeting that they like Russia. They're not threatened by, a class or a seminar. They're threatened by community power. Community power tied to anti-imperialism is what the American government is really afraid of. Because when it gets down to it, if you go to Venezuela, the Bolivarian movement, the Bolivarian circles are like that. They're in communities. They're in neighborhoods, right? If you go to Lebanon, Hezbollah, that's what they are. They're in the community. They're in the neighborhood, right? If you go to China, the Chinese Communist Party, they have a cell in every neighborhood. They have community meetings. That's what they are. This is what they are really afraid of, right? Is that kind of community empowerment, that democratic participation by the population centered around anti-imperialism in particular, which is what Uhuru is. They are an anti-imperialist organization. They come at things differently than I see things, but that doesn't matter. I mean, they're an anti-imperialist organization. They're aligned with Russia and Ukraine. They are aligned with China on Taiwan. They're aligned with North Korea on the Korean Peninsula. They're an anti-imperialist organization, and the FBI is determined to crush them because they are building real community power around anti-imperialism. And that is what the government is very afraid of.
The Communist Party, USA, used to be like that. Now they promote vote blue no matter who.
Yeah, and they're tiny. They're irrelevant. If they were huge, it wouldn't be great because they'd be promoting vote blue no matter who, but they're also they're not a factor. In the 1930s, the Communist Party USA would have their conventions in Madison Square Garden, right? They controlled major labor unions. They would organize marches of hundreds of thousands of people on Washington to demand veterans benefits or demand unemployment relief. They had influence over millions of Americans during those years, and that gave them the ability. And they did align with Roosevelt, but it made sense because Roosevelt had to give them something because they were serious players at the table. Nowadays, I don't think Biden cares what the Communist Party USA thinks of him. They could denounce it. He's like, who cares? They're not a factor, right? But back then, when the Soviet Union was a major country that was rising and industrializing during the Great Depression, at that point, the Soviet Union led this huge international movement called communism, and it was a force to be reckoned with. And the Black Panthers, I think, were very much an expression of the anti-colonial upsurge that came after World War II, right? Many countries around the world that had been colonized and oppressed broke their chains, had a revolution, a socialist revolution, and the Black community that felt it was an oppressed nation within U.S. borders had the same feeling. And the Black Panthers were kind of the American expression of that anti-colonial wave of revolutions that happened afterwards. But I must say this, right? And this is a weird revelation I had to. I just hung out with a good friend from Britain. We just spent the whole afternoon together. A British communist who's a good friend of mine. We were talking, and religion, since we're talking about religion and politics, this is important. Religion is not a thing in the UK these days, right? It's not a thing. But she was asking me about growing up religious, and I didn't even think about this, but she asked me how many times I went to church in a week. And I thought about it, right? When I was a kid, I went to church on Sunday morning, And then I went to youth group on Saturday or on Sunday night. And then usually we went to church on Wednesday also, because there'd be like a Wednesday evening meal followed by like a class or something like that. So I was going to church 3 times a week when I was a kid. Think about that, right? I think about, and that was in my little town in Ohio, that was the social organization. The people that I knew the best and the most were people that I was going to church with 3 times a week, And if you think about that, right, that's a really powerful thing. And that in a way, I'm very lucky that even though I ideologically, I don't agree with the religion or the ideology that I grew up with, right? I mean, my views have changed. I grew up learning what it meant to be part of an organization. You know what I'm saying? And we did things. Our church, we did community volunteering. We did churchy things, right? But I grew up being part of a group, right? And that's why when I became a communist as a teenager, I had to be part of a group. It wasn't an internet thing for me. I had to be part of a group. And, I have written a whole book criticizing the Revolutionary Communist Party and Bob Avakian, right? So I am not a supporter of their political line at all. I did a whole stream reacting to one of their people the other night. But I am thankful that I spent a couple years with them when I was a young man. You know why? Because they taught me how to do the work. We worked our butts off. We put up posters every weekend. We were driving to some college on the other end of the state or another state. We were putting up posters in the Black community. We were leafleting. We were selling the newspaper. If Bob Avakian came out with a new speech, we were making, CDs of it and distributing it on college campuses. And they taught me how to just go, right? To do outreach, to engage with people and promote ideas, right? And I was in the Workers' World Party after that for like 8 years. Workers' World Party, I learned a lot more politics from them. They educated me a lot about politics, and I studied politics, but the activism that I learned from the Revolutionary Communist Party, it was like constant. Every day, I was in college. Every day they would call me on the phone, on my little cell phone, my flip cell phone. Hey, can you go out and sell the paper? We're going here to sell the paper. Can you go put up posters with us? We're putting up posters here. Hey, can you go to this? Can you go to that? I mean, it was every day. And this was just in Cleveland. Imagine if I'd been in New York City. I mean, it was any political event, there'd be a book signing by some writer, and it would be about anything. And we would just show up and be there. And during the Q&A, raise our hands and give the communist line, and then try to sell newspapers to everybody at the event. And it was a lifestyle of like, go activism. And I appreciate that, right? Because again, for a lot of the people that I see now, communism is just this vague intellectual entertainment. They have no idea what that's like. They have no idea what it's like to go up to somebody who you don't know and try to get them to talk to you about communism and pay you actual money for a communist newspaper. They have no idea. Well, I do, thanks to the RCP. So I appreciate that about the RCP, and that's what we need more of, right? On the internet, it gets you into a bubble. You see people who agree with you. We need people who would never go looking for this stuff ever to start being encountered by these ideas. That's what we need, right? I published this book on the Houthis, right? So this is my book, Who Are the Houthis? What Are They Fighting For? Less than 100 pages long about who the Houthis are and why Americans should support the Houthis in their struggle against Zionism, right? So I had this idea. We're not going to be able to do it as CPI until at least after our retreat. I think we should make door knockers. Those like leaflets that you put on doors. And I think we should go all over this country and hang door knockers with QR codes for this book everywhere. Wouldn't it be great if American families woke up one morning and on their door, they had an ad for a book explaining to them, a very cheap, easy to purchase book explaining why the Houthis are good. You know what I'm saying? Imagine how many Americans who had never heard an argument like that might get on the internet, start reading what we have to say, and be confronted with an anti-imperialist argument. You know what I'm saying? That's what we need to do. We need to find people who would never go looking for this stuff and confront them with it in a way that would win them over. And when I say out of the movement to the masses, what I mean is this book is not written checking off the boxes, okay? Because I have a couple PSL books, the Platypus Society. They wanted me to write a review of a couple PSL books. And So they sent me a couple PSL books and I started reading them and I couldn't read them. They were unreadable because they were written checking off the boxes. You know what I'm saying? It was not written so that people would read it and learn. It was written, checking off the politically correct boxes. It's unreadable to average people, right? But I wrote this imagining some average person who knows nothing about Yemen or Israel or Palestine. I wrote it that way so that average people could read it, right? And that's what we need. We need outreach aimed at average people to win them to our perspective, right? And that means not being politically correct and not being woke. And it also means shifting the conversation away from culture war issues. Because at the end of the day, culture war issues, nobody ever changes their mind about, right? I mean, nobody ever goes, oh, a fetus is alive. No one ever goes, oh, the woman's right. No, they don't, right? I mean, no one changes their mind about abortion. With the LGBT issue, people might change based on life experiences. I've had people who they had a gay friend and that changed their perspective. But for the most part, if someone's part of a religious community that's opposed to LGBT rights, they're going to be opposed to LGBT rights. And that's not going to change unless they leave that religious community or something. So no one changes their mind. And that's why that issue is perfect for the ruling class, because it's just a fight that will never end, right? But this kind of stuff, talking about who the American government really works for and who these wars are really serving, and how it doesn't benefit America's working families to spend billions and billions of dollars enabling Israel to murder Palestinians while our roads and bridges are falling apart, while our schools are in shambles. This doesn't make any sense. Donald Trump says he's for America first. Well, America first would mean cut off Israel first, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? Biden says he's concerned about human rights. He's funding a genocide right now. How can he say that? And meanwhile, what about the people who voted for these politicians? We're not benefiting from this in any way, right? I mean, and you just make these arguments. People realize these wars are not serving us. Well, who are they serving? They're serving a system called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the rule of the world by big monopolies and banks that are trying to impoverish countries and are enriching themselves by keeping the world poor. And that around the world, there's countries like China and Russia and Cuba and Vietnam and Iran that have broken out of that system. And they're our allies because they're fighting against the same bankers that are destroying our country. And that the future of American working people is standing arm in arm with the people of Russia and China and Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and all those oppressed countries and demanding a government that serves us, not the ultra rich, a government of action that fights for working families and doesn't just bend over backwards and give Jeff Bezos and the Pentagon whatever they want. This is something that average Americans could very easily be recruited to. And I'm talking Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans, Christian Americans, Catholic, Protestant. This is something that just makes sense to people, right? The idea of a government that controls the economy to make life better for the people, right? That trades with countries on the basis of win-win cooperation. This is what Americans need to hear. And if we're arguing about transgender and if we're arguing about abortion, we're never gonna be able to have this conversation. This is the conversation that desperately needs to be had.
Yes, absolutely. All you just said. And the best way that the ruling class can undermine that at this stage is funneling people back into that polarized paradigm that they want to bring us. They want to bring us back to the way that it was 20 years ago. And, the real danger of voting for Democrats is that it drags the participants in this Vote Blue No Matter Who campaign into that pattern of thinking and behavior. It strengthens the state. It strengthens the dynamic of polarization. And, one of the arguments that these people I'm talking about who've reacted to Project 2025 have put forth is that, even though the Democrats are lame at fighting Republicans, they're still at least better than this super extreme version of the Republican Party that's emerging. But no, that's not an accurate picture of the situation. The problem isn't that the Democrats are poor at resisting the right. It's that the Democrats are a fascist party. They're actively pushing fascist policies.
Yes. Yeah. And the other thing that I'll add, right, is that that right now our politicians, we really should demand better from them. Because, if I am applying for a job, all right, and I go into the job and I find out who the other candidates for the job are, and I come into the job and I'm all like, well, that other guy who applied for the job, if you hire him, the business is going to catch on fire. And that other guy, if you hire him, there's going to be a flood. And if you hire the other guy, he's going to steal a bunch of money from the company. So I guess you got to hire me by default. They're not going to hire me. You know what I'm saying? That's what our politicians are doing. They're not making a case about how they're going to make the country better. They're just selling us, the Brooklyn Bridge. They're just selling us a horror story about the other guy. Oh my God, if Trump gets in, the planet's going to burst into flames from global warming and we're going to have a theocratic Christian dictatorship and they're going to kill all the trans people. So Biden, you just got to take Biden. And the Trump gets in, oh, we're going to have communism and, so you just got to vote for me. And they're not doing their job, which is to make the case that they have a positive vision, right? They're just engaging in this catastrophic nightmare, right? Of if you don't vote for me, the other guy is going to do bad things. So basically you have to give me a free pass on anything they do. And that's what they're saying, basically, right? But this kind of apocalyptic politics is a way to get a free pass. And the Democrats have been doing this shit for years, from what I understand, right? In the 1980s, before I was born, I understand the Democrats' talking point was, if you don't vote for us, the planet will burst into flames from nuclear war. Right? If Reagan gets reelected, if Reagan gets elected, if Reagan gets reelected, if Bush gets elected, there's going to be a nuclear war and we're all going to die. So you just have to accept our policies. Well, Reagan got elected, he got reelected, Bush got elected, and we didn't have a nuclear war. That was a lie. And then it became global warming, right? If you don't vote for the Democrats, we are all going to die from global warming. Well, global warming is a reality. I don't deny it. But the idea that if we don't vote for the Democrats, we're all going to be like flooded or something like that doesn't, and that they're always trying to create a catastrophe. And they talk about how this is a sales technique, right? That a bad salesman, I don't know, years ago I was apartment hunting and we'd find an apartment we want. And the realtor would always be like, well, there's a family that's going to come and buy it later today. You better buy it from me now so they don't get, and that's a sales technique. Make people make a quick decision because they won't think about it. Right? If someone's trying to scam you, oh, you got to decide now. Oh, you got to decide now. Oh, you don't make a decision right now. You got to do it right now. That's a slimy salesman technique. And the Democrats have been running that game. And that's why we don't have free health care. That's, Obama said he was going to pass the Employee Free Choice Act, and then he forgot about it as soon as he got into office. Biden said he was going to pass the PRO Act to support labor unions, and he's forgotten all about that. The labor unions that give all of their dues money to the Democratic Party to campaign for the Democratic Party, they get nothing in return, right? And Bernie Sanders' campaign was a little bit of a flex. It was like, we will actually give our money to somebody to kind of challenge you guys, but then Bernie just kind of surrendered and that was the end of that. But the labor union bureaucracy at this point has been just throwing away its members' money on the Democrats and getting nothing in return, decade after decade after decade, and it's a problem, right? And yeah, I'm speaking my mind, Rainer. You get me talking, you get me fired up. You're good at inspiring me, but continue. Say what you want to say.
Yeah, when it comes to the labor unions, there's recently been a sort of revolt within the United Auto Workers from the workers who support Palestine, and they're dissatisfied with their leadership for the leadership's complicity in the Gaza genocide and the leadership's willingness to continue supporting the Democrats. And they signed a letter complaining about that since the October 7th. What we need to do is, firstly, take up Lenin's advice to work even within the reactionary trade unions, because the trade unions are where the workers can be found. Some of the most conscious, most politically involved workers can be found. And that's the practical reality. If you don't like that the given labor union has reactionary stances, well, you still need to deal with that reality. And I posted a quote about that today from Lenin, where Lenin ridiculed the types of ultra-leftists who say that we can't work within reactionary trade unions under any circumstances. Lenin repudiated that, talked about how ridiculous that is. And I actually had the people who have been orbiting me for the last year, ridiculing my anti-imperialist stances. They said that they really revealed what they're really about by saying, "Oh, I suppose this means you think we should join the pro-Israel unions. Yeah, you should work within those unions because those are where the workers are. When you work within those unions, you're not strengthening the reactionaries, you're strengthening the revolutionary side because you're giving the revolutionary side the opportunity to engage with the workers and advance the agenda within that space."
Yeah, well, part of the reason that the UAW is having a good pushback against its pro-Israel position is because, you know, Detroit, even though it's not what it once was, Detroit is there's still auto factories there. And we have an auto worker member of CPI who was on the picket lines. His name's Tom Mitchlack. He was at the World Youth Festival with us, actually. He was part of the American delegation. A great guy, a great young man, part of our organization. He's a UAW worker. And, you know, a lot of his coworkers are Muslims because Dearborn, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit, which is the city built by Henry Ford, is the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the country. So Detroit has always had a really strong pro-Palestine movement. What's also interesting is, have you ever heard of Drum?
Drum. And for
Drum was the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, and it was a faction of the United Auto Workers that was formed in the 70s that were Maoist communists. And it was probably the most effective, like, Maoist communist infiltration of a labor union ever. They led wildcats. 1973, they led wildcat strikes in 3 different factories. And they were like a radical faction of the United Auto Workers Union that was led by black workers. And they had a lot of influence in Detroit. They eventually formed the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and then a lot of them, you know, merged into the Communist Labor Party, which was led by Nelson Peary. But you know, there's a very good book that I have here about this history. It's called, all right, I have it somewhere. It's called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, which is kind of a history of how in the 1970s, you know, there was a communist judge elected in Detroit who, like, had Mao's little red book on his judge, like, podium. You know, there was a lot of effective communist activism in the auto workers unions in Detroit in the 1970s. I can actually show a clip. You know, this is from a documentary that was made about Drum, and it's called it's, you know, one of the leaders of Drum, Ken Cockrell, kind of explaining communist ideology. You know, and how it applies to the factories. So this is from a documentary about Drum.
You little bullshit amounts of money for working, wages and so forth, and then they steal all that shit back from you in terms of the way you got his other things set up. His whole credit gimmick society, man, consumer credit, buy shit on credit. He give you a little bit of shit to cool your ass out, and then steal all that shit back with shit called interest, the price of money. Motherfuckers in non-producing, non-existent, you know, industries, motherfuckers who deal with paper. There's a cat who will stand up and say to you, he's in mining. And he sits in an office, man, on the 199th floor in some motherfucking building on Wall Street, and he's in mining. And he has paper, certificates, which are embroidered and shit, you know, stocks, bonds, debentures, obligations, you know. He's in mining. And he's sitting up in Wall Street, and his fingernails ain't been dirty in his motherfucking life. He went to Phillips Andover or Exeter. He went to Harvard. He went to Yale. He went to the Wharton School of Business, and he's in mining. And the motherfuckers who deal with intangibles are the motherfuckers who are rewarded in this society. The more abstract and intangible your shit is, i.e. stocks. What is stocks? A stock certificate is evidence of ownership in something that's real. Ownership. He owns and controls and therefore receives, you know, the benefit from. That's what they call profit. He fucking with shit in Bolivia. He fucking with shit in Chile. He's Kennecott. He's Anaconda. He's United Fruit. He's in mining. He's in what? He ain't never in his life produced shit. Investment bankers, stock brokers, insurance men. It's motherfuckers who don't do nothing. We see that this whole society, man, exists and rests upon workers, and that this whole motherfucking society controlled by this ruling clique is parasitic, vulturistic, cannibalistic, and is sucking and destroying, man, the life of motherfucking workers, and we have to stop it because it's evil.
There's a lot of confusion amongst white people in this country, amongst white workers in this country about who the enemy is. The same contradictions of overproduction, the same contradictions of increasing production are prevalent within the white working class. But because of the immense resources of propaganda, publicity, radio, television, journals, magazines, and so on and so forth, which can be drawn upon, white people tend to get a little bit confused about who the enemy is. If you take a look at, white workers in Flint, for instance, in the automobile industry, who are pretty hard pressed because the Buick plant up there is whipping their ass. And it's whipping their ass about twice as hard today as it was 5 years ago. But who do they think the enemy is? The nigger on the street. Crime in the streets, is a problem. Or black people, moving into our neighborhood, causing housing prices to decline and threatening to rape our wives and daughters, And as a result, you get a cat like George Wallace who comes along, and George Wallace is not the first of the populist fascists in this country. And George Wallace talks about how the big fat cats of Wall Street are messing up the country. It's the little man that's suffering because of, the big, rich financial bears of Wall Street in conjunction and in alliance with the niggers. And the white folks, the white workers tend to buy that shit up. They tend to eat it up. They tend to love it. That's not in Birmingham, Alabama that I'm talking about. That's in Flint, Michigan. As a result of that kind of thing, millions and millions of white workers in this country just don't understand what's going down and end up becoming counter-revolutionary, even though the contradictions which they face every day would say that they should be the most staunch revolutionaries. Black people represent, the most forward and progressive and militant movement inside the plant. Which are calling not for, in reality, they ain't calling for the destruction, of, the white working class. The demands which are being presented, are demands which are calling for an uplifting of the working class as a whole. And the actual fact of the matter is that the movement of black workers is a class movement that's calling for a total change in the relationship between workers and owners altogether. And what it's saying is that certainly we don't want all the shitty and lowest paying jobs in the plant. Certainly we don't want to be, most exploited people in the plant. And we aren't calling for anybody to be exploited. We're calling for the elimination of exploitation in the plants. We're calling for the elimination of racism in the plants. We're calling for the elimination of any kind of conditions inside of the plant, which are bad, for the basic, health and enjoyment, of life. We are not calling for the replacement of the black proletariat, with white workers, who happen to be in a higher stage on the ladder. We are not calling for a situation in which white oppressors will be replaced by black oppressors. We are calling for the ending of oppression altogether. Basically the reason that they're racist is because of the fact that they're afraid, that the little bit of niche that they got in society is going to be lost. But ain't nobody been trying to demonstrate to them that rather than being against the black movement and being enemies of the black movement, that they should be in favor of the black movement and supporters of the black movement, because the things that the black movement is doing inside of industry are basically in their interests. The kinds of demands and the kinds of movements, which black people are making inside of the plants are not inimical to the interests of the average white worker.
Yeah. What do you think of that, Rainer?
No, it makes me think of, see, the second half of that makes me think of what we've been talking about in terms of derangement syndrome about conservatives in America. Because one of the big things that the left does these days when confronted about its own failures is it blames the working class. It blames the masses for supposedly rejecting them after they claim that they've done everything right, that they've done made all the correct moves to organize the working class, but supposedly the workers have just been rejecting their appeals. But no, that can't be what's happening, because even in historically societies where there has been a lot of prejudice, the communists have been successful ultimately. And you know what Trotskyism was really about? It was about a divide between a faction which believed that the peasantry could be brought into the revolutionary project, despite there having been so much anti-Semitism within the peasantry in Russia at the time, and a faction that believed that the peasantry was irredeemable, fundamentally reactionary. That was, from what I understand, the thing that compelled Trotsky to go down such a destructive path. And even though the Trotskyism versus Stalinism debate, it's been we've gone past that now. That's been resolved essentially for decades within the communist movement. There's still that question of, do you want to embrace the masses or vilify the masses that is present within the global communist movement? And so we're seeing new manifestations of Trotskyism or Trotskyism type ideologies emerge with this rejection of the masses.
Absolutely. Wow. This conversation, Rainer, has gone amazingly. We've talked in so many different directions. So I tell you what I'm going to do. So we have 4 super chats to answer, and anyone else who wants to ask Rainer and I a question, please, send a super chat in. Super chats are great. They keep this channel going, etc. I live in New York City where the rent is too damn high, etc. But before we start answering super chats, some of our CPI members have made a beautiful video about our upcoming 4-day educational workshops. I'm going to put that video on. Rainer and I will have a chance to drink some water or rest our voices or whatever. It's only 4 minutes, so it's not that long. We'll put that video on, and then we will start answering super chats. So if you got anything you want Rainer and I to talk about, the vague theme, is religion and American politics, but we're talking about Trotsky and Mao and all kinds of stuff. So you can ask about whatever you want. Within reason, we'll answer it. So I'm going to put the video on, and then Rainer and I will answer your questions. Let's go.
Of the movement to the masses. April 26th to 29th, Vermont. Center for Political Innovation National Educational Workshop. Friends and allies, as U.S. society braces for an election year amid international turmoil and a decaying economy, many are looking, not just for answers, but for what they can do to change the course of history. How can we get involved? How can we make things better? The synthetic left offers nothing but cancel culture, pessimism, and anti-human sentiments. Often, this channels dissidents toward the right wing, which is wrapped up in the worship of markets and profits and has no real understanding of the global imperialist system and why it must be opposed, or the history of struggles for justice. With our unique message of optimistic, constructive, patriotic socialism and anti-imperialism, the Center for Political Innovation and the City Building Tendency stand alone in offering an orientation that points toward a brighter future for America's working families and the people of the world. The City Building Tendency is a fresh outlook rooted in an understanding of Marxism-Leninism and the global anti-imperialist movement, and draws from many wells, including Christianity, American history, and so much more. While the Center for Political Innovation has blossomed around a unique pro-humanity, pro-growth message, we aim to take this message further, lower and deeper to the real masses, so that the American working class may be awakened and brought to life by standing arm in arm with others in the struggle for justice. If you are a member of the Center for Political Innovation, a longtime friend or ally, or someone new who is exploring these ideas and concepts, we invite you to join us this spring. The Center for Political Innovation will host a 4-day national educational workshop at a beautiful facility in Vermont. The event will not only include political classes, but also group bonding activities, a talent show, music, arts and crafts, and other relaxing and stress-free activities. Attendees will get to know each other, share their experiences, and develop real bonds of comradeship. Many have been inspired by the book We Are City Builders, the Center for Political Innovation Educational Manual. This book has been utilized to lead discussion groups and has also laid the foundation for the series of classes known as the Saxton Lectures, which CPI members around the country have been trained to give as a way of teaching the basics of anti-imperialism, socialism, and the city building tendency.
We are excited to announce that at the upcoming retreat, a completely new textbook, a second volume intended to complement the educational manual, will be available and presented to all attendees when they check in. This new textbook will focus on the history of socialist and anti-imperialist organizing in America, the divisions in the ruling class, and give perspective toward building a base of support for our message among the broader population. If you attend, you will be the first to sit through and participate in the discussions during the inauguration of a second level of model classes, much like the Saxton Lectures, that members will replicate in the process of building the organization. It will be very exciting to learn and engage together with all of this completely new material.
We want to maximize attendance and not turn anyone away who is interested in the message. But from those who are able, we do request a $200 donation if possible to cover the food and other expenses for the 4 days of activities. For those who register, expect a follow-up call with CPI leadership to confirm your attendance and answer any questions you may have. You may also leave questions, additional details, or comments in the registration form. Please consider bringing a friend, family member, coworker, or classmate who may be completely new to these ideas. We envision this workshop as being part of the process of CPI becoming better aligned with our organizational vision to the masses. Subsequently, new attendees and guests of friends and members are encouraged and welcomed and will be given priority throughout the 4 days of activities and classes. We look forward to seeing you in Vermont. Best wishes, the Center for Political Innovation.
I'm sorry, that's coming up. If you want to register, you can register at the link. It's also down below. It's coming up, 4 days of classes. So now we're going to start hammering out those questions. And I'm going to let Rainer answer first, and then I'll answer after Rainer, since he's our guest, right? Our guest can go first. So Johnny Spinoza, he says, Caleb, for Rainer too. In my online Hegel study group recently, a normally very intelligent man said terrified that we might all end up on a list being investigated by Trump's Department of Justice soon for studying Hegel. What do you think?
I don't know. Here's the thing. The only way that you are going to end up on a list, the only way you're going to end up on a list while studying Marxism is if you apply that theory in a super serious way, like Uhuru has done. I've noted how Uhuru is the only communist organization that's so far been, whose members have so far been jailed since the Ukraine war began. And I think that's probably going to be followed by more ones. But yeah, it's notable how Uhuru is the only one that's been jailed so far during our era. And I think that's both because, as Uhuru has stated, they have a Pan-African role in particular, as in they're focused on ending colonial extraction. Colonialism is the foundation materially for the U.S. empire. And also because Uhuru has been so effective at advancing anti-colonialism. So I think that the only way that you're going to really be targeted in a serious way is if you apply those theories in a way that's threatening towards the state. Though it's also plausible that as the class struggle intensifies, the U.S. state is going to start going after people just for vaguely engaging with communism. We saw that in Indonesia, where hundreds of thousands of people were murdered for direct or loose associations with communism. And I don't know how much Trump getting elected is going to change that. Frankly, Trump he's just the next figurehead that's likely to assume that role within the system. What really decides how the system acts is the interests of the ruling class.
Okay, well, I guess my response to the question would be, first of all, this fellow in your study group ought to realize that the American government pays tax dollars, millions of dollars a year in wages to college professors to teach classes about Hegel. So I really doubt they're going to investigate you for reading it on an online study group. But that said, what I see there is kind of that derangement syndrome. And that, again, in what they did in Indonesia in the 1960s, there may be people like, I bet that Jack Probisek, maybe he wants to do something like that. But I feel like the majority of the U.S. state, rather, they would want you to go to an American university and study the Frankfurt School interpretation of Hegel. They wouldn't want to ban you studying Hegel. And that, again, they're more afraid of people putting it into practice, like Rainer said, building real organizations in the community. The other thing is, I feel like that that comment, well, it on the surface, it seems like Trump derangement syndrome. There's also an element there of like, that guy wants to be badass. You know what I mean? He wants to be like, like, I'm doing something that could get me arrested. Yeah. You know what I mean? That's a little bit, that's amusing. You know what I mean? He wants to be able to say that like he's doing something. Well, I would encourage him to go, recruit his coworkers to anti-imperialism. Go convince his coworkers that the Houthis are the good guys and the Israelis are the bad guys. Go spread anti-imperialism. Among his coworkers, among his classmates, etc. And that's much more badass than just having a Hegel reading group online. That's my advice to the guy. The other thing I will say is, Uhuru is the only group that's been like full on indicted in my lifetime for communism. There was a moment, and I mean, we should just talk about this history. 2010, right after, like 2 years after Obama got elected, the FBI raided the homes of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. That happened. And then they were all called before a grand jury. And they refused to testify against each other, which was admirable. And they then didn't imprison them, which is what they usually do if you don't testify before a grand jury. If you refuse a subpoena, you get contempt of a grand jury. You get 8 months in prison. They didn't give that to them. At the time, I protested the raids on the FBI, and I called into the Alan Colmes show like every night about how the FBI is raiding the homes of Freedom Road. To the point that Alan Colmes, the Fox radio host, was annoyed with me. He's like, "Are you in Freedom Road? Are you in this group?" And I said, "No, I just am mad about the U.S. government raiding their homes." But at the time, I must say, and I'm sure this will not please a lot of people, Freedom Road was much more anti-imperialist back then than they are now. At that time, Freedom Road was engaged in solidarity with the FARC. They would go to the court dates of, there were FARC fighters from Colombia who were in American prisons, and they would go to their court dates and do solidarity with the FARC. They were very, very anti-imperialist. But right now, what Freedom Road Socialist Organization focuses on is trying to get Turning Points USA clubs banned from college campuses. So, when they were being targeted, they were like Uhuru, they were doing anti-imperialist work. Now they're just kind of a wokeified liberal organization, So I'm disappointed with how Freedom Road has deteriorated. And I think the first sign that Freedom Road was going in a bad direction, they published a manifesto a few years back saying that Russia was imperialist. And that was like the first sign that something was off. And then they said Russia was imperialist, and then one thing led to another. And then they got Trump derangement syndrome. And now Freedom Road is kind of in a negative place, but they did get raided by the FBI. And that was when they were doing imperial, but they didn't get indicted. So that's a little bit different. So I just wanted to share that history. All right. And if anyone else has any more super chats, Rainer and I are here to answer your questions. The next one is for Rainer, and it's good to see you, Caleb, and Rainer, wishing you well. What do you have to say, Rainer?
Oh yeah, I'm doing so well right now. I'm close to a transition point in my life where I'm going to be graduating school over this next month. Then I'll start looking for a job. I'm optimistic about my future. And I think that my life is going to get better as time goes on. I mean, Caleb, you said that after since you turned 30, your life has gotten better. And I feel like already my life is pretty good. I mean, here's the thing about me. I've had to overcome a lot of mentalities within my work that used to make me neurotic and discouraged. And it really hurts my mental state in my work. But I feel like I've overcome so many counterproductive mentalities. And I think that's really part of why I've been able to mature beyond the old pan-leftist, you could say, ideology I used to have, where I was invested within leftist spaces, and those spaces fed into those unhealthy mentalities. I think I'm in a healthier space now.
Great. Well, I'm really glad to hear that you're in a healthier space now, Rainer. That's really good to hear. And I guess what I would say is that, in my experience, the best, antidepressant, the best, stimulant is revolutionary work, right? Being in an organization, working with comrades, going out and trying to achieve goals and bonding with people in the process, it's really good. And I would also say the worst thing in my experience is being isolated on social media and just being on the computer. Right? Because behind a computer screen, people say really nasty things they would never say in public, and the Trump derangement syndrome and all of that. And I think that a movement is a really good for mental health in general. The other thing that I would say is, in the lives of various people that I know are Marxists, part of the struggle is the ability to be politically active, because you got to pay the bills, right? You got to pay the rent. You got to take care of things. You got to pass your classes if you're in college. And that a lot of revolutionaries struggle. Just how do I get my life set up in a way that I can do the activism that is really important to me, right? Because that's what I really want to do. I want to be an organizer. But how do I find an arrangement in my life where I can do that and get by and have what I need to survive? And it's not easy. And so, a lot of revolutionaries do struggle with that, So, it sounds like you're figuring things out. It's not a great time to be looking for a job, but it's a better time than a few years ago, right? There's still a lot of hiring going on these days. The wages are low, and, inflation is not good, but, there still are some opportunities, and, I hope you're able to find something. And yeah, hey, it's a struggle, but, it's important to have comrades. That's what I say. None of us can do it alone. And it's important to have comrades. And we have such a toxic culture where people are taught to be very competitive and very judgmental. And to have people who share your values as an anti-imperialist that you can consult with about personal stuff sometimes, not stuff that's necessarily political. It's a very rewarding thing. And that's one of the great things about CPI is we're there for each other in a lot of ways. We have our Zoom meeting every Saturday. We have our committee meetings, and we have our meetups and stuff. And so, that's my response to what you had to say there. And we're really happy to have you as a member, Rainer. We're proud to have a prolific writer like yourself as a CPI member. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Next question. Are you scared of involvement of Israel versus Iran? I had to say it that way because they wrote, are you, but I think he means, obviously, are you scared of our involvement in Israel versus Iran? So go ahead.
Scared. Well, this conflict is really is the logical conclusion of the tensions that the Zionists have been making present within that region for so many decades. And it was kind of predictable that at a certain point, the Zionists would intensify their genocide against the Palestinians, and then that would provoke attempts to intervene from the neighboring powers. I'm not scared that the Iranians are going to do anything rash, because that's not in their interests. And frankly, what gives me the most sense of security when it comes to these kinds of global conflicts is how much of a paper tiger the U.S. empire increasingly is. The U.S. empire is shrinking in its ability to inflict harm upon the globe. And the U.S. empire knows, like these foreign policy strategists in Washington know, that Washington wouldn't be able to win in an actual war against its biggest adversaries. So I think that the U.S. empire is going to continue provoking its adversaries, but there's a good chance that the U.S. empire is just going to continue to decline without bringing about an event of the same scale as World War II. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't seriously agitate against that, because this more optimistic scenario I'm talking about, that's partly dependent on what we do. So we have a certain amount of control over this.
Very good. And I do want to remind people we're getting down towards our last super chat. So if you want to ask any more questions, we're getting down to the wire. If not, this stream is probably going to end pretty soon. My answer to the question is I don't know what's going to happen because Iran has to strike back. If they don't, they lose their credibility as a country. And I'm not saying that because I think they should or whatever. I'm just being honest with you. If you bomb the embassy of another country, right, and in another country, you violate the territorial integrity of Syria and bomb the Iranian embassy and kill a top Iranian general and 7 other Iranian citizens, Iran has to retaliate, or else they lose their credibility as a country. And any country would respond to this. Iran has to strike back. I'm surprised they haven't struck back yet. But in a way, I think that shows to a level of strategic prowess on the part of the Iranian leaders, because Israel was all set for them to strike back on Monday, I believe, and it didn't happen. Iran, if they don't strike back, I will be shocked. They're going to do something. But I think one thing, and I'm just talking off the top of my head here, why should we assume that Iran is going to attack Israel? Because Israel has all kinds of tentacles all over the planet. There are all kinds of businesses and foundations and organizations that are tied with Israel. So, the amount of targets that Iran has to choose from in terms of retaliation is massive. You know what I'm saying? And so it looks to me like the Iranian leaders are being strategic, and they're saying, all right, they want us to just retaliate. We're not going to do that, right? We're going to retaliate on our own time and our own terms. I'm honestly scared about what the retaliation might be, because I hope that the way they retaliate doesn't involve any civilians dying. That would be awful. I don't want to see war. I don't want to see conflict, but I'm trying to think of this from the Iranian leaders' perspectives. I don't see how they can not. You know what I'm saying? And that worries me, right? Because I mean, as a Christian and as somebody who wants peace in this world, I don't want to see anyone get killed, even soldiers. I don't want to see them get killed either. But if Israel does this, Iran as an anti-imperialist country, I mean, they've dealt with so many vicious, cowardly attacks like this from Israel. They're going to have to retaliate. They just have to. And that's not a moral statement. That's just a fact, right? Any country, in order to maintain its credibility, is going to have to retaliate. And that retaliation is going to come. And I worry that American media is going to make it sound like that retaliation came out of nowhere, right? That it's just, Iran just randomly attacked Israel. That's awful. And that's, of course, they always do that, right? And did they show us the family members on television of those Iranians who got killed? No, right? Did they show the people crying and mourning the losses from the airstrike? No. But you can be sure that if Iran retaliates in a way that Israelis die, American media is going to talk about, oh my God, those poor people, and it's going to humanize them and all of that. And that's kind of another point that I've touched on in these streams a lot. I really don't like people who cry on command and feel outraged on command. I really don't like it, and I'm sure that if or when Iran retaliates, the response of American media will not be honest. And I worry that this could lead to a full-on escalation in the region, which would not be good for Iran, right? Iran doesn't want World War III. Netanyahu seems to want World War III very badly. Iran knows that Netanyahu wants World War III. So I suspect the Iranian leaders are trying to retaliate in a way that doesn't give Netanyahu the World War III he wants. I think that's what they're trying to figure out how to do. How do we retaliate in a way that we maintain our credibility as a country, et cetera, but we don't give Netanyahu the regional war? Because at the end of the day, the only way Netanyahu can stay in power is if this conflict in Gaza, if the bombing and the operation against Gaza turns into a regional war. If not, he's out of politics. The Israeli public, they don't like him anymore. Biden has been trying to remove him with like a color revolution. And this is like Netanyahu's last hope, right? So Netanyahu is going to be leaving Israeli leadership soon if he doesn't get the regional war. And Iran knows that that's what Netanyahu wants, and I don't think they want to give it to him. So that's my response to that. All righty. Now, Mariah asks us, please talk about how evangelicals were taken over by Zionism. I don't remember this level of fanaticism in the 90s. Catholics don't even seem to be as fanatical. What do you say, Rainer?
Well, what I can speak on, because my theological understanding is limited, is how there's been, well, for one thing, after 9/11, the war on terror, that was a huge factor that radicalized a lot of people on the Christian right towards a pro-Zionist stance, towards neoconservatism. And even though there's been this political reorientation where a lot more conservatives have been becoming anti-war, now there's a conscious effort by the Feds, I think it's quite evident, to steer conservatives back in that direction that they were going in the Bush years, and also divert the kinds of conservatives and libertarians with anti-war potential and some even anti-capitalist potential towards that reactionary position.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, this Christian Zionism stuff has been escalating over the years. And like one thing I remember is when I was a kid, for a long time, people that were like evangelicals, it was trendy for them to go like, well, I'm a Christian. Right. And, before they might say I'm Presbyterian or I'm Methodist or I'm Catholic, but suddenly it was, I'm a Christian. But then after it was, I'm a Christian, then it became, I'm a Judeo-Christian, right? Which, with all due respect to my Jewish friends and comrades, there's no such thing as a Judeo-Christian, right? Like, what is this? If you're from India, are you a Hindeo-Christian? If you're from Saudi Arabia, are you a Muslim-Christian or whatever? You're a Christian, right? And in fact, the epistles, right? At the end of the Bible, you have the letters that were written by the Apostle Paul. He says very clearly, Christianity is a whole new religion now. He says, there's a whole thing that they talked about. One of the big problems Christianity had in its early days was that in order to become a Christian, you had to get circumcised. And a lot of guys, they were interested in Jesus' teaching and all that. But then if you said to them, and you have to get circumcised, they didn't want to convert. And so the Apostle Paul said, look, you could be circumcised in the spirit, and that we're our own religion now. We have nothing to do with Judaism. Judaism is where it started, but Jesus came for all mankind. He didn't come for Israel. He didn't come for the Jewish people. And there's no such thing as a Judeo-Christian. But out of the blue, all the evangelicals started saying, well, we have Judeo-Christian values. And I remember after 9/11, I had a teacher, a science teacher, no less, in the 8th grade, who was explaining that 9/11 happened because in the Middle East, they don't have, quote, Judeo-Christian values, and that Islam, it's okay to kill people. And just awful things like that were being said. And that part of, getting Christians to be Zionists was this whole thing. I don't know. There was a series of books and films called Left Behind that were screened. And it was about like the end times starting in Israel. And there was this whole thing of like courting the evangelical Christian right to believe it was like their duty to support Israel. And some of the stuff was very, very cringe. Like I remember this book series called Left Behind, which was like, it was like a fictionalized account of the end times, the rapture. And of course it starts in Israel. And all the Christians get, abducted up in the rapture or whatever. And so then there's a few people left behind or whatever, they discover their faith and they're fighting the Antichrist or whatever. But they have this problem in the book, which is that the Jews, obviously they're not Christians, so they don't get raptured. So how do they deal with that and not be anti-Semitic? And so as a plot device in the book, they have the head Jew, the Jewish Pope, like convert all the Jews to being Christians. Which is, anyone who knows anything about Judaism knows there is no Jewish Pope. There's no head of Judaism, right? There are Orthodox Jews, there are Reformed Jews, there are conservative Jews, there are Hasidic Jews. The idea that there'd be some figure in Judaism that would just convert them all to being Christians, that was just a way to avoid being anti-Semitic in the book series. That's all that was. And it was pretty cringe. And that there was just a huge effort to convince Christians that it is their duty to support Israel. And making big stretches. And, I have friends, there's whole YouTube channels that have been dedicated to debunking this. When I was in Iran, I heard from Reverend Stephen Sizer, who's a minister in the Church of England, who has dedicated his career to arguing that Christian Zionism is a heresy. And actually, he points out, I didn't know this, Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism because the Church of England was promoting the idea of sending the Jews to Palestine as a British Empire colonial project before any Jews ever got recruited to it, right? And that shows that Zionism is very much an imperialist creation as a movement. The fact that the Church of England was for it before any Jews were. That's very interesting. But Christian Zionism in America, I remember I had a friend growing up. It was a friend lived down the street. One time he said he wanted me to go to church with him. So I went to church with him that Sunday, and it was Israel Sunday at the church. And as we were coming in, they were giving us all Israeli army yarmulkes to wear on our heads, and we were singing the hymn Marching to Zion, right? And as we were singing it, up on the screen, they had like footage of the Israeli army like marching with their guns. It was like a fascist rally I was at practically. And I just wanted to go to church with my friend, and I ended up with an Israeli army yarmulke on my head and like images of Israeli soldiers like, goose stepping. And it was like I was at a Netanyahu rally basically that I kind of got tricked to going to. It's a funny story. But these things happen, and they have done a lot. And they Mike Huckabee, he goes to Israel all the time. They fly him there, all expenses paid, and show him around and convince him that it's his duty. And I know Tucker Carlson is in hot water all of a sudden because Tucker Carlson did an interview with Christians in Israel about how Israel doesn't treat Christians so great. And everyone's really mad at Tucker Carlson for that. Well, can they contest what's said? Is what's said in the video false? Right? If they're arguing that Tucker Carlson's interview is inaccurate, that is fair. But just bringing that up, I think that's a fair point, right? Are Christians fairly treated in Israel or not? Another thing that and I'll just throw this out. This will be the last thing I say about this because we got another super chat, a couple more actually. And I'll just throw this one out there, is that you constantly hear about Christians being persecuted in Iran, right? Have you ever heard about this? Christians being persecuted in Iran. Well, I have been to Iran, and I made a whole documentary about it. And in the film, I actually visited Armenian Christian Church, which I attended on Sunday morning. They openly practice their faith, and they actually have a special law where they don't have to follow Islamic law inside of their church. They have communion wine, alcohol. Alcohol is illegal in Iran, but not inside of the church. As long as you drink it in the church grounds, it's allowed. Women don't have to wear headscarves inside of the church. They have a special accommodation for Christians. When you hear about Christians being persecuted in Iran, that's because they're Zionists, right? It is illegal in Iran to be a Zionist, right? Zionism is absolutely illegal. Jews in Iran have to denounce Israel, right? Everybody does. And the Christians who are persecuted are usually people that are Baptists, or they're in some kind of evangelical group that is promoting Zionism. And they have pamphlets or literature promoting Zionism. And that's what they're being arrested for. It's not for being Christian. So that's an important point to make, too. I just wanted to share that point. All right. Okay. So we got a couple more, two more. So what do you think of RFK Jr.? Is he a plant?
That's honestly plausible. I'd have to do more research into potential connections he might have, like if he's connected to the deep state in the way that Posobiec is. All I know is he's been mixing anti-imperialist positions in certain areas and anti-establishment positions in certain areas with an extreme iteration of Zionism. It's extremely disturbing. It's ruining the third party movement at this moment.
Well, yeah, I have similar thoughts. I don't know what to make of RFK. When RFK is not talking about Israel, I tend to agree with a lot of what he says. But the stuff he says about Israel is so insane. He's not just a Zionist. He's like a Netanyahu Zionist. He's like an insane Zionist, He says things like the Palestinians are the most pandered people in the world, and Israel never kills children, and all kinds of stuff that it's like anyone who knows anything about that conflict wouldn't say. And that's just weird. I don't even know what to make of it. So that perplexes me. It's just weird. To be fair, though, I think there is a layer of people in Israel who are pro-Russia, right? They actually got a law passed in Israel making it mandatory that they teach the achievements of the Soviet Union in World War II in their textbooks. And when I was at a conference in Russia in 2018, the Israelis got up and talked about how we've gotten it. It is required in Israeli schools to teach about all the Jews that the Soviet Union rescued and stuff. And, you know, I mean, that's certainly an important thing for people to know about, to defend the history of the Soviet Union. And there is a faction in Israel that are ultra hard right-wing Netanyahu Zionists and also pro-Putin, right? And it's a small group, I think, in Israel, but that may be who is funding JF or RFK, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just speculating because his politics don't make any sense, really. They really don't make any sense because the positions that he takes on Israel, they don't match any of his other positions. And so it's very odd. Some people have speculated that RFK doesn't even really think this, right? And that he just feels like he doesn't want to have Israel attacking him. And so, you know, some people have speculated that he's intentionally doing a bad job of defending Israel. And he's saying things that he knows will be just easily debunked and mocked by pro-Palestine activists, right? Because he could do a much better job. I mean, if he didn't say things like, you know, Israel never kills children. Geez, there's only videotape of lots of children being killed by Israel, you know, and he doesn't have to say things like, you know, like the Palestinians are the most pandered people in the world. I mean, he's saying things that very dumb right-wing Zionists say. And I feel like RFK is a smart guy, so he can't be that dumb. Like something's off about the whole thing. I don't even know what to make of it, honestly. I liked RFK, and I even was willing to stomach some of that until October 7th. But after Israel started their killing spree in Gaza and just started the relentless bombing of Gaza, I couldn't. You know what I mean? I couldn't stomach that. I have friends who really like RFK still, and I am against burning bridges. I want to maintain relationships with other people. I'm going to stream with Laurie Spencer tomorrow night. She's very pro RFK and very pro Israel, but she's very anti-imperialist when it comes to Russia and other things, and she's open-minded. So I'll stream with her. I don't burn bridges over everything. I want to keep the door open. You know, I would go on Fox News. I went on CNN. I had no problem doing that. I will go different places and engage with different people, but I really don't know what to make of RFK. It doesn't make sense. Something's off. That's what I think about RFK. So there you go. And we got one last question, but if another one comes in, we can keep going. But I'm starting to get toward the end of my rope. So is Rainer. But we got one more here, but we could probably handle a couple more. But it's getting late here. So this is from Gavin, and he says, separation of church and state means no state religion, not that religious values cannot be legislated. What do you make of that, Rainer?
I haven't heard this argument. I haven't heard this argument until you just presented it to me. And I think that shows how I have this secular background where I haven't thought about religion too much, except as it relates to politics. But I can look at the example of Nicaraguan socialism and how they have fused Christianity with socialist politics, and they have a severe policy against abortion. I don't know if that would work here though, because the thing that we've touched on it in the past part of this stream, you need to be careful about how far you go with promoting religion in America when it comes to the state, because like if it's perceived that religion is superseding freedoms, like fundamental freedoms of how we live, then that's going to get too much backlash for it to be the situation to remain tenable.
Yeah, so I guess I'll read it again. The separation of church and state means no state religion, but not that religious values cannot be legislated. And I would agree with Gavin on that, because I mean, who's to say that somebody's opinion about some social issue isn't going to be rooted in their faith, right? Who's to say that somebody's perspective on an issue like, taxes or war or, whether we should have the death penalty or not religion is going to be a factor in how people see these things. So I think the idea that religious values can't be legislated, there'd be no way to do that. Now, the Constitution, in addition to having no separation, or to having a separation of church and state in the First Amendment, we have First Amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or restricting free practice thereof. So that's the First Amendment. Then later there is an item that says there is no religious test for government positions, meaning that you cannot require someone to have a particular religious faith in order to hold a government position. And that's interesting because we have not at this point ever had a president who was not a Christian. And we've only ever had two Catholic presidents, JFK and Biden. So even though we don't technically have a religious test, we have never at this, as a country, ever elected a president who was not at least nominally a Christian, and almost all of them have been Protestant Christians. And that is the majority religious view in the country. And when Al Smith ran for president in the 1920s, he was the first, major party candidate to be nominated who was Roman Catholic, and they made his Catholicism a big issue in the campaign, and he lost because of it. They said that he would be, ruling as an agent of the Vatican. He was a foreign agent. The Ku Klux Klan mobilized their people, who were regularly Democrats, to vote for the Republicans, and Al Smith lost. And when JFK ran for president in the 60s, he gave a very big speech, basically saying, even though I'm Catholic, I will put my religion aside. I will not be letting the Pope tell me how to be the president. And he had to make a really big point of distancing himself from being Catholic to be president. And, 1960, is not that long ago, but it was a really big deal that they had a Catholic president at that time. It was a really big deal in the country that he was Catholic. My mother had members of her family who were outraged that a Catholic could be president. I think my mother's great aunt or something was furious about it. She remembered telling me, and that there was, at that time, there were a lot of Protestant Americans who thought Catholics were no good. That shows you how far we've come, because like bigotry against Catholics sounds like something from it's like archaic, right? What, it was this Oliver Cromwell or something, but that's, that shows that as a society, things have changed. And that what's interesting now is that, Joe Biden and JFK are both Democrats, right? Because Catholics in this country tend to be Irish or Italian, right? And urban, right? It was recent immigrants from Italy or Ireland or Poland or Eastern Europe. That's who Catholics tended to be, and so they were in the urban areas, and the Democrats ran the urban political machines. And what's interesting is the Catholic Church is for the first time in its history dealing with the fact that part of the reason it's changing, part of the reason Pope Francis talks the way he does, is because of the fact that for the first time in history, the majority of Catholics are not white. And that is actually a big change, right? In Europe, which used to be the stronghold of the Catholic Church, it's become a very secular society. However, Catholicism is very big in Latin America. It's very big in Africa, and it's very big in Asia and the Pacific. And so now the Catholic Church is realizing, even though the hierarchy of the church are white Europeans, the majority of Catholics in the world are not white. And that is a kind of a weird moment that the Catholic Church is having to deal with. So it's the Catholic Church, the way it sees things is changing. And so that relates to what we talked about earlier about, the trad Catholics, because I think a lot of the things the trad Catholics don't like are probably reflective of that demographic change, right? Not all of them. I think, it depends, but I think a lot of the things that the changes that have gone on in the Catholic Church over the years. I'm not Catholic, and I have never been Catholic, and I don't understand Catholicism. And I'll be honest, with all due respect to all my Catholic friends, as somebody who grew up Protestant, and I consider myself to be Protestant now, I do not understand Catholicism. And that's okay. It's not for me to understand. But, Catholicism is something that is very important. I wrote an article a long time ago about the geopolitics of the Catholic Church, and how the Catholic Church tends to follow Central Europe. It tends to follow Germany and France, the European mainland, Italy. It has a slight opposition to the British, and sometimes it's with the United States, and other times it's not. The Catholic Church turned against the Vietnam War in the 70s, and that made a big deal. the Catholic Church opposed U.S. foreign policy in Latin America in the 80s, and that was really important. And that, the Catholic Church, it shifts. And right now, the Catholic Church seems very pro-China. And that's an interesting turn. But that reflects France, Germany, Italy. They're very pro-China. They're not pro-Russia, but they're pro-China. And I think that that's interesting. And that the Chinese Communist Party and the Catholic Church have reconciled. For a long time, there was the government, the Communist Party approved Catholic Church in China that the Vatican did not recognize. And then there was this underground Catholic Church that the Catholic Church recognized. Pope Francis changed that, and he recognized the Chinese Communist Party Church. And that was a really big deal. And the Vatican established diplomatic relations with China. That's a really big deal. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen next. It's a very, very weird moment. But what Gavin said, I think I would agree with, which is, yes, people are going to legislate according to their religious values, right? People and their opinions about politics. You cannot, you cannot put your religion in a box and just say, well, I'm just going to legislate and then have no influence by religion. Obviously, legislation is going to be influenced by religious values. There's nothing we can do about that. But declaring a state religion in the United States would be a huge mistake because we're such a religiously diverse society. All right. Well, I think that's it. So any final thoughts, Rainer?
I'm glad I've been able to cover this this subject with you. And I do believe that Project 2025 and the intelligence manipulations surrounding it, they are big threats towards our project for creating an anti-imperialist united front. And, these political actors like Posobiec, they are boosted by the algorithm, so we can't compete with them algorithmically, but we can keep building our organizational strength.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you, Rainer. Go check out Rainer's writing. Is it newswiththeory.com or .org?
.com. You can also find me at Rainer Shea at Substack.
Okay, very good. All right, newswiththeory.com, Rainer Shea at Substack. All right, everybody, have a good night.